Some of the legislative 72-hour waiting period, etc. This afternoon, we're going to focus on land and wildlife conservation. Standing behind me is Jeff Romano. He's from Maine Coast Heritage Trust. He's going to give an overview of conserved land in Maine and some proposed legislation for long-term funding. So I will turn it over to Jeff, and it's all yours. And everybody will be able to hear it because the microphone works now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. As Mike said, I'm going to be providing a quick overview of land conservation in Maine, what the state is of land conservation. There's a lot of conversations in the State House and other places, and a lot of kind of misinformation, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page of what land conservation looks like in the state of Maine in 2025. I have this opening slide here. To me, this captures the breadth and diversity of land conservation in the state. It's working lands and access for snowmobiling and hiking and deer habitat. Let's see, is this going to move or not?
If it doesn't, I can read it. Just enter it. Let do it.
Here we go.
I can be your mouse. Just tell me.
Okay, I got a lot of clicks in it, sorry. So the data that I'm going to be presenting today is based on two primary sources. There's a database of GIS that the state collects, and at Maine Coast Heritage Trust we also do a survey of land conservation organizations every 5 years. I've tried to blend those together where it's appropriate. These are estimates largely, but they're really close to the actual numbers. The GIS data layer in the state captures about 90% of actual conservation land, so I have to account for that a little bit. So in the state of Maine right now, there's 1.36 million acres that are public lands. Sorry, I got too many clicks. 650,000 acres are owned by land trusts. And then there's another 2.4 million acres that are conservation easements. These are our private lands, and the conservation easements that ensure that the land is either not developed or it's available for working forests or agricultural. A lot of times they allow for public access or guarantees public access. And so the total in the state is 4.4 million acres. So sometimes people will see the 4.4 million acres and assume that's all public ownership. It's not. It's a big mixture in the state. Again, 6.9 is the percentage that's owned by the public.
So you pointed.
Yeah. Okay, so
we'll have this all worked out by the time you're
I put too many of these things in there. So just to go through the history of how we got here. So some of the early conservation efforts. Yeah. So this is 1980 data that I was able to find. So in 1980, the state had about 950,000 acres of public land, and most of the conservation land in the state was publicly owned. So these are places like Acadia National Park, White Mountain National Forest, Baxter State Park. That's Bradbury Mountain State Park. There's about 70,000 acres of other state parks in the state. And then the largest chunk of this land in 1980 were public lands. These were lands in the unorganized territory. The deeds trace back all the way to 1820, but a lot of those properties were consolidated into larger holdings. That was about 450,000 of the public lands in the state trace all the way back to 1820. So in the late 80s and early 1990s, there was a change that began in the state. There was a lot of unease about a change in land ownership patterns in North Maine woods. There was housing booms and real estate booms, and there was a move to start conserving land more aggressively in the state, making sure that public access was secure. So in that time, the Land for Maine's Future program was created in 1987. The voters approved a $35 million bond. And that money was all for public land acquisition at the time. And at the same time also, a lot of the local land trusts were formed in the state. So Maine Coast Heritage Trust started in 1970, but there's about 80 local land trusts in the state. They're on towns, sometimes counties or regions. And a lot of them formed in the late 80s and early 90s at this very time. So this property here is Dodge Point. That's the first property that was protected with Land for Maine's Future money. That's in Newcastle. Mount Kineo was protected. That's sort of an iconic. So a lot of the properties that $35 million were spent on were these really iconic properties like Mount Kineo and the Cutler Coast and places like that to get people onto the land. And again, I mentioned the land trust movement took off. So Maine Coast Heritage Trust started in 1970. We didn't own any land for about 15 years. We were working more closely with the Acadia National Park to conserve land near that park through conservation easements. When we started acquiring land in the late 1980s, this is a property we have in Hamilton Cove and Lubec. And as you'll see, there wasn't much land conservation by land trusts in the 1980s, and that has really taken off. So LMF steps up in 1997, so there was kind of a lull from 87 to $35 million was spent, and the country had a little recession in the 90s, and not much happened from a land conservation standpoint. In the late 90s, Governor Angus King created a Land Acquisition Priorities Committee that was it spurred a lot more conversation about rejuvenating Land for Maine's Future program at the time. It led to a $50 million bond issue. Yeah. So again, at the time, you can see that in 1997, we had a little bit of an uptick in the amount of public lands that occurred from the 950,000 acres. That Land Acquisition Priorities Council had those numbers for land conservation for land trust, 45,000 acres and 54,000 acres of conservation easements. So the $50 million bond came in 1999. They added an emphasis on farmland protection. They also added emphasis for recreational water access, boat launches and things like that. They also created an opportunity for cooperating entities on the Land for Maine's Future program. So the first bulk of LMF was about expanding public ownership, mostly IF&W and Bureau of Parks and Lands. But the realization at that time was that we don't want to rely on the state to have to do all this. Let's work with municipal partners, let's work for land trust partners to share the cost of acquiring this land and also maintaining the land. So this is an example of a boat launch in Gardner that was acquired. And this is Beach Hill Preserve, which is a coastal mountains land trust preserve in Rockport. It's a good example of one of the early cooperating entity projects that LMF took place. This is a highly used project, really close to a tourist destination and other places. So then LMF evolves over the next 10 years or so. We had voter approved bonds, kind of hit or miss. So the first two bonds were multi-year bonds, and then we had bonds in 2005, 2007, 2010, 2012. They combined for about $46 million. In that time, LMF added a priority for working waterfronts, and also working with Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, we added a prioritization for deer habitat. Subsequently, in the 2020s, after another lull, the legislature approved a $40 million appropriations for LMF. In that iteration, we built into the program a greater emphasis on community projects, so projects where closer to where people live and work and recreate. And then more recently, we created what's called the LMF Trust Fund. So what was left of the $40 million that was appropriated by the legislature in 2021, in 2023, that was moved out of the pot of money that the state manages within the general fund and moved into a separate account, and then it began to accumulate its own interest incomes. So effectively, that $40 million has turned into $42 million with interest income over the last 2 years. An example of sort of the community aspect, this is Hackers Hill, which is a property overlooking Sebago Lake in the town of Casco. You can see they have outdoor concerts here. It's a kind of a spiritual place for a lot of locals there as well. Again, it's kind of the program is transitioning. In the early effort was a lot of places like Mount Kineo, these kind of iconic places like I was saying. And now the program is more and more incorporating these projects closer where people live. And it still does the large landscape ones, but it's doing more for more people now. So big picture on LMF. Click it again. Click it a third time. Anyway. So the process is, for those who don't know, the LMF is a competitive grant process. So the program, it's not, the state doesn't go out and aggressively look for properties. What's happening are communities and organizations, land trusts, and others are coming together. They're coming to the Land for Maine's Future program with a proposal, and they're competing against other projects around the state. And the LMF board, which is comprised of people nominated by the governor, approved by the legislature, and by city commissioners. They go through a rigorous process of evaluating and scoring those projects and then decide which projects get funded. It's all based on willing sellers. It's a really public process. The public's invited to attend all these meetings. And all acquisitions are done based on appraised value. So that you have to get an appraiser that determines what the value is, and that's what the program can't spend money above appraised value. There is municipal involvement throughout the process. There's notification to municipalities. So for municipalities that may be concerned about land being conserved in their town, they are notified from our LMF. They are invited to come to the public meeting and make their case if they have any concerns. I've only seen that one time, one individual from a select board, not speaking on behalf of that select board, showed up and had some concerns. And other big picture items, the program matches 1-to-1. So for every state dollars put in, the applicant has to come up with another dollar. In practice, it usually is more like $2.50 to $3 to 1. So for every dollar the state does, we're matching $2.50 to $3. And the language, the last language there was about, used to be in all the bond issues, and now it's in this legislation, in the statute, that hunting, trapping, fishing, and public access cannot be prohibited other than what under the current laws. So that's what the state is doing on a state basis. Just for further information, the federal government also provides some land acquisition money. Here's some of the programs. Forest Legacy focuses on large forest easements primarily. Land and Water Conservation has money to help expand places like Acadia National Park and the White Mountains, but also provides money to the Bureau of Parks and Lands. It gets fed down to municipalities that can acquire municipal properties or state parks. And then these other two protect wetland habitats primarily for migratory birds, a lot of times duck habitats, things like that. So again, back to where we are in conservation. So that's kind of how we've gotten to where we are. There's 31% of our property in the state that's conserved as public land. Another 15% is owned by land trusts, and the bulk, over 54% of these private conservation easements. So I'll go into a little detail about what those mean. Again, this one more. Further illustrations of the growth that's happened over the last 30 years. Again, most of the growth has been in that conservation, easement, and land trust category. Public lands have only gone from 4.8% to 6.9%, so it hasn't been this big land grab on the part of government. Just to put the public lands into context, so Maine at 6.9% is actually the lowest percentage in New England. It's one of the lowest percentages for public lands in the Northeast, and the East Coast, excuse me. Just for comparison, the state of Florida, 26% of the state of Florida is publicly owned. New Jersey, which is a lot of the times the butt of a lot of the jokes around here, over 25%. I'm proud of New Jersey because there's a lot of Italian Americans there, but there's 25% of New Jersey is publicly owned. And even in New Hampshire, live free or die, 20% of New Hampshire is also publicly owned. Now these states also have land trusts that own land and that do conservation easements, but in Maine the mix is much stronger in the part of the private sector doing this work. And I think that's what's been so successful, is we're not dependent on the public sector. This is the private sector in concert with the public sector in terms of LMF funding and things, but it's really private entities that are stepping up to provide what the public wants in terms of access to the natural resources, in terms of working landscapes. This is happening in other states, but the federal government in large part are state and county governments. Further evidence of the working forest easements. So these 5 working forest easements comprise 43.6% of the conservation land in the state of Maine, 1.9 million acres. It all started with the Pingree easement in 1999. That was actually done with no public money at all, but 762,000 acres. So when you look at that property, the Pingree family, which has been around for centuries, I guess, their land ownership is larger than that. They looked at their entire land ownership and they said, this is the part we're going to conserve. They left other parts remaining potentially for development or what have you, what they want to do with it. But that 762,000 acres is conserved. It's all working lands. It's all in the tax rolls, as with all these other properties. The ones that have public dollars involved are guaranteed public access. Or you can access the Pingree easement, it's just not built into the easement, but that's all open land for traditional uses. So a closer look at land trusts. So 94% of the land trust conserved lands. This is lands that we own in fee or lands that we've conserved with conservation easements. At least 94% of that land is open for hunting. These are the litany of the recreational trails that are available, over 2,000 miles of hiking trails, 1,000 miles of snowmobile trails, 1,200 miles of mountain biking trails, and 675 miles of ATV trails. So this is access for a whole variety of uses. And there's more than 230 recreational water access sites on these properties as well. I think I have less clicking from now on. So a closer look at land trusts in terms of working land. So 86% of the land trust conserved lands in the state are managed as working forests. There's another 40,000 acres that are working farms. And there are 63 coastal access sites that are available for commercial fishermen, whether some of them are docks and piers, but the bulk of them are access for clammers and wormers and folks like that. I know a lot of people are concerned about property taxes. So property taxes, this is the data for land trust preserves. So again, land trusts own about 650,000 acres. Of those acres, 70%, almost 70% of that land is still on the tax rolls. Another 21% is land that the land trust is tax exempt, but they're making payments in lieu of taxes as if they were still on the tax rolls, or basically as if they were enrolled in tree growth or open space, which are current use programs available to all private landowners. So the most recent year, land trust paid over $1.5 million in taxes to local municipal governments. And again, some people have concerns about you're paying less than the highest and best use. Yeah, that's correct. As are most lands that are owned by forest landowners and farmers and others. Most of the land in this state, about 12 million acres, is in current use out of the 19.5 million acres. And current use is assessing that land based on how it's being used as working forest, as working farmland, or as open space available for people, as opposed to its development potential. And so land trusts are taking advantage of those current use programs the way a lot of other landowners, large and small, take advantage. And it's a change that the voters approved in the 1970s. I think it's done a great job of conserving land in the state, not permanently, although de facto a lot of this land hasn't really changed over time. I think the current use program is a really good program. So in terms of the property taxes on conservation easements, there are some easements that land trusts own that are on state or government properties, so those lands are tax exempt. But the bulk of the conservation easements that land trusts hold are on private land ownership, so all of that's on the tax rolls. So when you combine all that together, 97.8% of the lands that land trusts have conserved have remained on the tax rolls. Just for some background on public lands, the public lands are tax exempt, but it doesn't mean that they're not also contributing to the tax base. This is data that I had from 2020. The state parks has a revenue sharing for municipalities that state parks are located. On that 85,000 acres, they share over $400,000. That compares really favorably. That's probably better than if that land was in tree growth. Those towns are doing better with that land. The federal government as well, for all lands that are wildlife refuges, state parks, the national monument, not state parks, national parks, the national monument, national forest, they do revenue sharing or payments in lieu. They did $857,000 last year on that 283,000 acres. That's pretty comparable to what that land would be generating under the tree growth tax program. And then sometimes there's sort of interesting one-off kind of thing. So in LMF, when the Cutler public land was acquired, there was an agreement made at the time with the town of Cutler to maintain a fund for keeping the town whole on taxes. Same thing happened in Amherst. There's an Amherst community forest. It was the same type of an agreement. And also in the town of Addison in Washington County, a new wildlife management area was created there. And there was a fund created to make sure that that town wasn't losing tax revenue. So a lot of times this conversations happen on given projects, and land trusts and conservation partners are in concert with the community to make sure everyone is supportive of what the goals are, and that it's public access, it's maintaining the wildlife habitat and so forth, but making sure that it's not negatively impacting the tax base as well. It's probably too small for you to see, but this was a chart that we presented recently at a hearing on a bill to cap public lands in the state. It just provides a breakdown of where some of the public lands are. So you have the total land area in the state. Total land area that's conserved is at 4.4 million acres. And part of this was based on this bill that tried to cap public land ownership and was defining public land ownership more broadly than reality. So again, this gets you that 7% on that right-hand column is how much is conserved. There's about another 8% that is defined as public interest, and this would be land that is privately owned either by a land trust or just a regular private landowner that the state or federal government had some sort of property interest in because they contributed Land for Maine's future funding to, or Forest Legacy funds to. So that's about 8%. And then there's another 7% of the land that's been conserved that's outside of both of those. So it's not publicly owned, and the public has no public interest in it, hasn't contributed any money to it. So it's actually a pretty good breakdown, I think, that shows that every project is different, and sometimes it makes sense for the state to be really engaged in it if it's a project that has really significant wildlife, natural resource habitat qualities, or it's really important from a public access standpoint with large numbers of people, particularly from people traveling great distances to go. Those types of projects really call on state or federal partners to contribute. And then you have more local projects where it's really a local interest, and it makes more sense for those resources to happen more locally. And this stuff happens organically in partnership. Land trusts and state agencies and municipal partners and others work collaboratively, project by project, to figure out what's the right mix for each particular project. I think the largest message I want to deliver to you is that again, like I said earlier, a lot of how this plays out in other states is a really government-focused effort. You go out into the western United States, you're looking at 50, 60, 70% of those states owned by the federal government. Those public benefits that the public wants, that access to those outdoors, the protection of those natural resources, the main blueprint for addressing that is really leaning on private entities, private landowners who are being philanthropic, private landowners who are willing to put conservation easements on their property to protect these natural resources for the long haul, and land trusts to step up and provide private dollars to provide the access, not only on our lands. There's a lot of public lands in the state that land trusts actually help to manage on behalf of the state. That Dodge Point picture that I showed you earlier, that's owned by the state's Bureau of Parks and Lands and the local land trust, the Coastal Rivers Conservation Association. Hope we get that name wrong. It's Coastal Rivers. They manage that property for the state. And that happens, Kennebec Highlands is the same thing, 6,000 acres not far from here. The Seven Lakes Alliance Land Trust is a key manager of those lands. And that's the type of collaboration and partnership that you get in Maine. It's not all the burden is being borne by Maine taxpayers. And I think it's worked well for the state. And I think the support that we see from the voters and others, I think, is a testament to that support. And I'm happy to answer any questions before we go to it.
I want to just jump in real quick, and I'm sure you have some questions. It'll take me just a minute. I wanted to recognize there's a number of board members that are here. Can you just stand up real quick? I don't want to miss you. I think there's Bob Humphrey, who's on our board of directors, Vic McCallum, Teddy Schofield.
Behind you.
Right behind me is Mike Parker. Is there anybody I've missed? We also have Brent, who's a wonderful volunteer here. He does a lot of work for us. Ginny Hurley, she's my favorite writer. Her and I are writing a book right now on the 50-year history of Salem, and it's just wonderful to work with her. Tom Dorr, another great volunteer. I see the department has showed up, which is wonderful. We're going to get to you guys in a minute. And then back way in the back is Jamie. She's a new hire here, and she's just been a rock star in the office. She's awesome. I wanted to recognize her. So with that, we can take any questions. Oh yeah, by the way, Daniel, another awesome volunteer who's recording. He's just a jack of all trades and just a really nice man. So with that, if you got any questions on land conservation, I want to get into sort of our partnership that we've had with the Nature Conservancy, Maine Coast Heritage Trust. But any questions on land conservation in the presentation that you've had? Now's the time to ask it. Nobody knows more, I think, about LMF, Land for Maine's Future, than Jeff and Caitlin. So now's the time to ask if you have questions. Oh, man, it's the easiest crap.
David, if you want me to fill in a little bit of space.
Yep.
David grabbed me and asked me to come up. I wasn't prepared, so I'll be very brief. In addition to being on the board of directors here at SAM, I'm also on the board of directors of the Royal River Conservation Trust. And we're on the front line. We're in southern Maine. We represent several communities: Pownell, Durham, Braden, Gloucester, Yarmouth, North Yarmouth. So we're in Cumberland County. We're just north of Portland, and there's a lot more pressure where we are to try to conserve land, to find land that's available. And if you look at some of the numbers that Jeff presented, the same amount of money that could buy 1,000 acres in Aroostook County might buy 100 acres in Cumberland County. But the impact of those 100 acres just 18 miles outside of Portland is equal or possibly more important. So, there's a whole gamut of things, from these huge concessions in the north to little parcels, a 25-acre farm, et cetera, et cetera. So support your local land trust.
Thank you. You have a question here?
Curious how your organization lines up with out west for Action Family, the BLM land in comparison.
Yeah, that's really a Western issue. I'm aware of the BLM lands. I think it's
Same philosophy, is it?
I'm trying to think. BLM tends to be, it's similar to I think more like the Forest Service would be, at least the traditional U.S. Forest Service, because so much of Maine is forested, whereas I think of BLM lands as open areas for grazing and mining and things like that. But the sort of philosophy of multiple use that you get traditionally on the Maine Forest, the U.S. Forest Service model, I think that's generally pretty consistent with how land trusts in the state of Maine manage their land in terms of forest products, water quality, recreation, wildlife, those aspects that you get from the U.S. Forest Service model, I think is pretty consistent across the board. Obviously, there's certain parcels where one of those would be a higher priority than the other in certain places, depending on the resources on the ground.
Without any more questions, I'm going to ask Representative if you'd like to join us on the panel. Are there any other legislators here? Conservation-minded people?
I gave him lunch and left.
I guess.
That's what happened.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to just speak real briefly to the relationships that have helped shape land conservation in Maine. Back years ago, when I was a legislator, Jeff used to lobby me, and we got to be friends. He and Tom Abello in the governor's office. We became friends over the years, and we fished together. Jeff, whenever I take him fishing, will say, I don't care about fishing. But boy, as soon as we start catching fish, he cares. No, we've built a bond. Caitlin came in a little later with the Nature Conservancy, and together over the years, we have helped to shape some of the most comprehensive land conservation programs in the state. Most recently, we worked together to create the LMF Trust Fund. So what that did was, we were getting bonds, but when it takes sometimes years to do a land purchase, that money would sit there. So if you had an appropriation or money, it would sit for years while you were working through a project. So we got together and said, why aren't we making that money work for us? So we changed the LMF program into a trust fund where the money would go, generate interest, and that interest could be used to either conserve more land or invest in those lands. That was pretty significant. The $40 million appropriation was spearheaded by the same group with the help of then Senator Timberlake, who was in leadership, and key members of the legislature. That's where we got the $40 million. So we've had a hand in it, and we've got some other bills that are coming forward this session that I think are very creative. So I wanted to talk about those. And what I'll do then is I'll turn it over, and maybe Jeff and Caitlin, you can describe some of the bills we're working on and why we're working on them, and how they will dramatically change land conservation in Maine. And anybody has questions, just raise your hand and we'll jump right in and we can ask some questions. But, so which one of you would like to go?
Sure, yeah. And I'll take a minute just to introduce myself. My name's Caitlin Nuzzo. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy here in Maine. I do both federal and state-based policy for TNC. I grew up in Merced County. I have lived in Maine my whole life. I absolutely adore the work that everybody does from all different sectors, all different angles to protect the places we all love, right? So I think it's really important to think, it's really exciting to be here and honored to be here and talking to folks about how we protect this beautiful state that we all live here for a reason, and I think it's really great to be here. I'll talk first about this new bill idea that we're shopping around. Jeff and I have been meeting, and David and others, we've just been trying to knock off as many meetings as we can to talk about different ways where we can find streams of funding for the program. As we said, going after bond funding or governor's allocations, budget allocations is really challenging. We want to, as you do in your own budget, you want to find a sustainable source of funding for things that you're trying to do, and so that's what we're looking at. You can't rely on windfalls. You have to really think through how to find sustainable funding. And so one of the new creative ideas we've been working on is, we know that our region is going to be looking for renewable energy development. We know that in order to realize some of that renewable energy development, there will need to be changes in our grid. There will need to be changes in the way that we transmit energy. Maine has been and will continue to be, I think, a source of renewable energy for other states who have a lot more people who need that energy. And so these transmission lines are being proposed and being built. I mean, we all lived through the New England Clean Energy Connect project, the transmission line in Western Maine. These things are coming. How do we think through if this is happening, if we are at the crossroads of this, how does Maine benefit from these opportunities? And so we've been thinking creatively, like, can we get a piece of, if we are exporting energy as a state to other states, can we get them to pay a premium on that, right? If we are exporting potatoes and lobster and getting people in Boston to pay more for it than we are, there's gotta be a way to operate the same way if we're exporting energy. And with these transmission lines in particular, they're such long, the impact is so, it crosses so many different communities, so many different habitat types. It's such a big impact. So how do we mitigate for that impact? So we've been floating this idea of trying to get the energy users at the other end of the line from out of state, from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, whoever decides that they want to buy into the energy that's being generated in Maine, to pay a little bit more for that energy so that that money can go into mitigating the impact it's had in Maine. So we do not want Maine ratepayers to pay a single penny more for energy. That is not our goal. We want to make sure that if we are exporting a resource and we in Maine are handling the entire impact of that, how do we get the out-of-state buyer to compensate or pay for some of that impact? So we're talking with, none of us work in energy development here, so this is kind of a new thing for us to learn as we're going, but we're really trying to be creative. The intention is, if other states are using Maine to meet their clean energy goals, how do we get them to help pay for our conservation goals to mitigate that impact? I don't know if you want to talk about the other ideas, or...
No, but that's great synopsis of that idea. I mean, obviously the money that would be generated would go into the Land for Maine's future program, and then they would acquire land in the state to mitigate against those impacts.
to understand the impact of that and why Sam is interested in working with this policy, is that all of us are seeing on the landscape, all you have to do is look in either direction, all of the solar development that's going on the landscape. Well, when you put in a solar array that has a multitude of impacts, I'll start with the impact of the solar panel itself. A solar panel generates up to 150 degrees of heat during a hot summer day. It only uses about 25 to 28% of the sunlight. The rest of the heat goes somewhere. Either in a rainstorm it goes into the water and into the streams, or it goes back into the air. And it creates a lot of heat. Well, we're in transition right now from going from 30 to 50 acre solar arrays to hundreds of acres. And I believe there's one proposed to go to 5,000 acres. A 5,000 acre solar array is going to have a massive impact on the landscape. It has fences around it. Wildlife can't get in and out of it that walks on four legs. The heat that's generated by it is going to have an impact on the landscape. Well, part of what's driving that is this requirement for renewable energy for other states that have already developed all their land to get that energy so they can take credit for it politically. Well, I would argue all day long that when you put a corridor into northern Maine, and you hook up to a wind power project, that's why that project's going in. All of the energy produced from that point on to fill that line is going to have an impact on the landscape. It's going to be more wind power, it's going to be more solar that hooks to that line. So yes, Massachusetts will pay some initial cost to put the line in. But what they're not paying for is what comes next, which is 20 years of energy development that we haven't seen on the landscape yet. And that's going to be anywhere from 100 to 1,000 acre solar arrays in northern Maine. That has an impact on the landscape. Now, you're going to hear some people opposed to that because they don't want to raise electricity rates. They don't want to do this. They don't want to slow down energy development. Well, I would ask you, if you put these throughout northern Maine, are we still the Maine people want to come and see? They want to live in. My point is there's a balance here somewheres where we have energy development, but we conserve lands to keep Maine unique, what it is, protect our wildlife. And that's what this is about, is where is that balance? And should we continue to be a cheap date where Massachusetts and Connecticut can get our energy, take credit for it, and not really pay for it? So that's why we're going to put this policy forward, is there's a trade-off no matter what you do. And however you feel about renewable energy, when you put a solar array on the landscape, I see it as a failure. I see it as a scar. Because we haven't figured out how to conserve our resources and protect our wild places. In a sense, we're developing ourselves out of existence. And that's where I came from when I joined this effort, is let's figure out a way to keep Maine unique and strike a balance on energy development. And that's what that bill is about. So remember the NECEC debate where people in the Forks region said this energy is benefiting Massachusetts and we're getting nothing for it? That was the main theme. And this is an attempt, if you're going to do it this time around, you're going to build in those impacts right now before they do the development. So that's where we are. Tom?
We've already got a corridor, and that's from Holton to Kittery. And they won't use that. They'll scar up the rest of the state. And we're paying for it because we're subsidizing it.
Well, that corridor, CMP already has a corridor that goes into northern Maine. I think that's probably the one you're...
Are you talking about the turnpike?
Yeah.
The turnpike.
Oh, you're talking about the turnpike.
Yeah,
Sure.
we asked the same question.
Yes,
We
we
asked the Maine DOT, why can't we use this? They looked into it, legal, there's all kinds of challenges with that. It was an unsatisfactory answer to me also, but they told us this is a non-starter, this is a no-go. But as David started to say, CMP owns an existing corridor now that runs in the same area. And I mean, they haven't opened up the RFP for this new project, the request for proposals. We have nothing on the table right now. They're about to open and invite proposals. We expect that CMP will come in with we already have this corridor, we already own all of the land here, and they got a big federal grant. So we think that the actual proposed line will be very different, completely different from what it was 2 years ago. We think it'll be a totally different developer. But I think we should continue to explore, can we pass laws to work with DOT to change it so that they can use that corridor, right? That's definitely, it's a great thing to think about.
Turnpike would love it because they'd have some revenue. from it.
Right, yeah,
So that covers you from Kittery to Augusta.
right,
And the rest of it is it's basically a federal road
right,
under the auspices of the main DOT.
yeah.
They get no say in it. The legislature giveth, the legislature taketh away.
Penny, you had a question?
Not a question, but a statement. The legislature just had 4 bills on net energy billing. The committees held the hearings, and a lot of people voted against net energy billing. But we're talking about, like in Worcester County, all those potato fields. We're not gonna grow potatoes when we put those solar panels in there. And like in Farmington, those great big fields full of solar panels, we're not gonna grow our food. We're not gonna have to. And say nothing about the eyesore. I thought environmentalists were concerned that we needed to keep it pristine and complementary to the eye. That's not solar, that's not.
Well, the 3 organizations worked for a couple of years to strengthen the mitigation components of these solar and wind projects, including corridors. And that went through the rulemaking process. You guys can probably speak to it better than I can, but we tried to discourage solar and wind development in those pristine places, and then use mitigation basically as a punishment tool if you do put it in a good place. So it's cheaper to build now in places that are compromised, like gravel pits, polluted sites. So we've got legislation passed, and we're trying to get the rules over the finish line. Maybe the two of you, one of you could speak to that.
I can, yeah, I think the focus of that bill was what we call the mitigation hierarchy. So that's avoid, minimize, and mitigate. So we're encouraging developers to avoid the most special places. Then if they can't avoid, can they minimize the impact on special natural resources? And then finally, if you're in a situation where you're trying to develop a project and you've avoided as much as you can, you've minimized as much as you can, what's left over, you're still having an impact, we're expecting you to mitigate for that. And so it's a really exciting new development. Right now, when a project is developed, the state, the main DEP, is the one who issues that permit, and they get to require what that mitigation looks like for each project on a case-by-case basis. We heard from the commissioner of IFW, from other state agencies, that it's challenging to do that on a case-by-case basis, and that many developers actually want to be able to write a check, that it's just simpler to say, this is the impact you're having, this is what we need you to do. Currently, under current law, which is what happened with NECEC, the state tells the developer, your impact is X, so you need to conserve or protect Y number of acres to compensate for that impact. And then the developer, who's not a land conservation expert or a land trust, has to go out and find parcels of land to protect to offset the impact that they're having. So we tried to create a model where you could either do that, you could continue to do it that way, or we developed a fee system to put a dollar value to the mitigation so that the developer could say, yes, I did my best, I tried to minimize that fee as much as I could, but I'm still having X impact, so I will pay the state to compensate for the impact that I'm having. And that fee would go into the Land for Maine's Future program, so that the developer isn't the one who's all of a sudden running around trying to find a landowner willing to sell to them. Now it's in a much more public, more transparent process where that check would go to the Land for Maine's Future program, where community projects will come forward and apply for that money rather than just what's available today. I have to sign this paper, I have to find a property. And on the net energy billing piece, I think that's more, I think, for the rooftop solar than, but this is like a little bit out of my area of expertise. I actually think those hearings were postponed because of the snowstorm.
Thank you, Mary.
So there is still an opportunity to follow that, and I think the legislature's not meeting all of next week. So there's time in March to follow that. If you wanted to offer any comments there, I think you still have an opportunity to do that. I don't know if
I
yeah.
think one of the pieces too that's important to understand is that when a developer has to mitigate, say in the case of CMP and 50,000 acres of impact when they put the line in, there's only so much land on the landscape that there's only so many people willing to sell. So what happens is you create an environment where the landowners can name their price on that mitigation project. So what then happens is that CMP or whoever the developer is has to pass that along to the consumer. So if you have to pay 40% more for that land than you should under normal circumstance, they're just going to pass that along to the consumer. So your electric bill goes click, click, click up. This, what it allows us to do is get a more honest and transparent system where those mitigation projects are in the public eye, they're run through a program that is accountable, has a long history of success, and you get better conservation projects in the end. And that's what that bill is meant to do. I will be honest with you, I'm getting to a point where we have to, as many people, weigh in on how much is enough. When you drive through Augusta, these solar panels are everywhere. The people in Augusta are pushing back and saying enough is enough. And if the solar industry doesn't recognize what's coming, you're going to see proposals to do complete bans on solar development in the future. And I don't think it's very far out. If they don't get better policies on where they put them, the main people are going to tell them where to put them. You can translate that however you want. So anyway.
Well, the other thing I would add is what we're working on isn't trying to impact that decision at all. It's more, if these things are going to happen, we want to make sure that they're compensating, they're mitigating for those impacts. So we don't want to put a thumb on the scale or not. I mean, those decisions will be made by the legislature on other bills. You know, so it's not, we're not saying we want this Northern Maine corridor to happen or not happen, but if it does happen, we think it should contribute. And that power goes out of state, that those ratepayers from out of state should be contributing to the mitigation. And on a similar vein, another bill we're working on has to do with the rewriting of the mining excise tax law in the state, which is a law that's been on the books since the early 1980s. And we haven't had any mineral mines in the state, so it hasn't generated any revenue. But there's a possibility of a lithium mine in Newry, Maine, that may trigger the mineral mining excise tax for the first time in 4 years. And when that was drafted in the early 1980s, a portion of that money, the revenue was supposed to go to land conservation. It doesn't specify land for Maine's future because it didn't exist at the time, but it talks about land conservation and land management and those types of things. And so there are at least one bill that's in the hopper this year that would update the mineral mining excise tax. It would increase the tax itself and then direct a higher percentage of the funds to land conservation than what exists under the current formula. And again, this isn't us saying we're for lithium mine or against lithium mine or any other mine that shows up. It's if it gets through all the DEP permits and goes through that political process and starts digging metal out of the ground and has to pay a tax, and want that tax, instead of going to the general fund, we want it to go to Land for Maine's Future to compensate for the impacts of the environment.
So Penny Morell in the back made a good point about environmentalists and what do they want on the landscape. I would stress to you, I've been all over the world, to Russia and whatnot, and when I grew up in Maine, Maine was different than it is today. It is changing dramatically. And the development that we're seeing in southern Maine, I could never have imagined, but it's creeping northward. I want you to think about what you want your grandchildren to see, what you want Maine to look like in 50 years. Now's the time to make the policy that builds the vision for 50 years from today. We'll all probably be gone, at least most of us, like myself, unless I can live to be 150 years old. But the truth of the matter is, we've seen what can happen in a short lifetime, and that, if you extrapolate out 50 more years, what will Maine look like? So now is the time to get it right, to figure this all out, and to build a Maine that we all want to be proud to live in. So that's where we are. So with that, questions. Are there any questions from anyone in the audience before we move on? Go ahead, Brett.
Just curious as how you look at Poland Springs, where they're taking the mineral out of the land there.
Yeah, I mean, there has been legislation in the past to tax water extraction. It hasn't really gone anywhere. We haven't embraced that concept. You know, people have different views on it, but I you know, there's people use water for a bunch of other sources too. So if you're going to tax water being extracted for water bottles like this, you know, why are you not taxing water going into making beer and other things in the state too? That's what I mean. But I wouldn't want to tax either one of them.
Don't tax my beer anymore.
Yeah.
That's all.
There's, years back, the Augusta Water District drilled 3 wells out on the Long Brook Road. And the first one, when they punched through the granite, a 12-inch casing, it lifted the well drain right off the ground. They discovered an underground river that comes out of the White Mountains and goes under the Kennebec, and every day that flows more water than the Kennebec does at flood stage and goes out into the Atlantic Ocean. And there's a spot out there about 8 miles out from the end of Damascove Island where the ocean actually is like that. It's lifted up the volume of that water. So an operation like Poland Spring isn't robbing us of all our water.
To that point, I chaired the taxation committee as a senator, and the bill that he's talking about came before a committee I chaired on a couple of occasions. And I asked the state geologists, hydrologists, if you took 1 inch of water off of Moosehead Lake, how many gallons would that be? And how many gallons has Poland Spring taken out of the ground? 1 inch of water on Moosehead Lake far outweighed anything Poland Spring touched. And I think at the time, the legislature killed those bills because of the threat to jobs and I think a very clean economic engine in Poland. And that was really what drove it. And really, it's a drop in the bucket, as you described, of how much water comes out of the ground. But I remind you that clean, potable water is in short supply around the world. And we should always do our best to protect our clean water, because in other parts of the world, they don't have the kind of water we do. My trip with then Secretary of State, now I believe he's auditor, Matt Dunlap. We went to Archangel, Russia, and it gave me a new perspective on clean water. When we arrived, we had our security briefing. They said, do not drink the water, do not brush your teeth in the water, don't put water in your mouth in any way. If you're in the shower, close your mouth. The water comes out of the faucet brown. Their rivers are brown. They're so polluted. When you get to that stage, it's too late. My point is that potable water is, in some parts of the world, a rare commodity. And so we should do all we can to protect what we have here, because other states don't have it.
Did you use vodka when you brushed your teeth?
We consumed a lot of vodka, and for me, 1 shot is a lot of vodka. I don't do well with vodka, but yes, they drink a lot of vodka. So we're gonna move on. I think. Is there any more questions before we move on? I really do appreciate you coming and doing your presentation. We are about a half an hour ahead of schedule. I think we want to move on to
The next piece, the main, yeah, our next piece on the agenda is Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, an update on purchasing and protecting deer wintering areas,
Thank you.
as well as information regarding national and state policy on coyotes. So, looks like coming up we have Ryan Robichaud and Jennifer Vachon somewhere.
Yep, and we have Colonel, Deputy Commissioner.
Yes.
Peabody.
Tim
Wow,
Peabody.
Come on up.
Oh,
Nate, come on. Nate,
if you're within the Fisheries and Wildlife, come on
Yeah,
up.
come on up. Bring up your people, all of them. Nate told me he was gonna be zooming in.
Yesterday, I had to zoom in.
Yeah, so this is a privilege to have you in person.
Yeah. Oh, it's a privilege for me.
For us. I'm gonna grab a couple extra chairs. Why don't you introduce yourself, Representative?
I'm Representative Rick Mason. I am serving my 8th year in the IFW committee and my 8th year in the legislature. And I represent the good folks of Lisbon.
He's one of the most level-headed legislators you'll meet.
A unicorn.
A rarity in today's world. You gonna do your presentation?
Yeah, so Ron's gonna give experience, because we'll go much better than Jeff said.
Great.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Robichaud. I'm the Wildlife Management Section Supervisor for Maine Fish and Wildlife. And I've been asked by Sportsmen's Association of Maine and come in and provide some updates relative to our deer habitat management or conservation and management efforts within the agency, as well as an update on our predation management program, which we operate as well. Before I get started on our deer habitat conservation and management program, I think I just wanted to articulate one point in that, and I'm guilty of the same thing myself, and that's staying hyper-focused on a singular or particular wildlife species when we talk about land conservation. So just a reminder that, you know, the land and the conservation efforts relative to deer habitat also benefit a myriad of other species, especially when we talk about winter shelter for deer in the spruce fir hemlock conditions on the forest landscape, the mature forest conditions. There's dozens of wildlife species that take advantage of those habitat conditions during the course of their lifespan, and they truly number in the dozens of species, both amphibians, birds, and mammals. Next slide, please. So folks should be well aware, if they aren't, LD 404, which passed in the summer of 2021, provided funding opportunities and authorization for the department to acquire and manage deer wintering habitat or deer habitat in general. The legislation required land to be managed and acquired under this to be managed specifically for the purpose of deer habitat. It increased the emphasis of deer habitat conservation through Land for Maine's Future Board, and also created funding allocations through the sale of antlerless deer permits to help fund the conservation efforts as well. In addition to the state level funding, the department has opportunities to access federal aid dollars through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we currently have an agreement with them to use these state funding sources as matched to the federal dollars. And I think David was pretty clear in articulating that this does it provides a lot of opportunity to match much more federal dollars than we bring for state dollars. It's about a 25%, 75% state and federal funding split. Next slide, please. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on our deer acquisition, conservation, and management efforts. And we've transitioned from pure acquisition since we've acquired some lands to a combination of acquisition and subsequent management and stewardship of lands. Shortly after the legislation passed, we updated our deer wintering area acquisition criteria, and there's a lot of metrics that are involved with the size of the acreage that might be within the project area, how much of that is functional habitat for deer in a wintering condition, but also summer habitat or summer range opportunities for management. We assess current and historical deer use to help drive considerations on how important has this area been for deer and their survival through the winter months. We also assess the habitat conditions, specifically the species composition, age class distribution within the areas that we have interest in. And then we also look across the landscape, how does this fit into other conservation areas or other areas of importance that we know for some of the same species and considerations. That same summer, we directed our staff in the regional offices to identify a minimum of 3 project areas that they deemed the highest priority within their geographic responsibilities. And we concurrently were hiring a new position that was created to be solely focused on deer habitat acquisition and conservation in management. So we since have hired our deer habitat biologist, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Hill, combined wildlife biologist and licensed professional foresters to help in those efforts. To roll out our efforts on acquisition of deer habitat, we first started to engage with our conservation partners, and I think there's probably been discussions where folks are well aware that conservation happens continuously throughout the state of Maine, and a lot of our conservation partners have spent years, and in some instances decades, culturing relationships with private landowners, and so we wanted to both capitalize on those relationships, but also we wanted to be aware of conversations so that we didn't insert ourselves into a process that might be challenging from our partners' perspectives. And I can't stress enough that the value of those relationships in being successful in conservation efforts really requires multiple people working in the same direction, and also a willingness from the landowners to want to engage in those efforts. Good examples of those relationships have been with the Aroostook County Conservation Association and their strong advocacy for the Caribou Stream Wildlife Management Area. We also work quite closely with the Conservation Fund to help enable the McQuahawk Wildlife Management Area. We refer to it as the Reed Deadwater Project through the course of acquisition. We also began to review and assess both those internal priority areas that were identified by the department, as well as project areas or opportunities that came to the department from outside sources. To date, we've reviewed and engaged on 37 different project areas. 20 of those are continuing to be ongoing, mostly related to the timing and the landowner interest at the time that we engage. Quite a few of those conversations are like, well, this is not a deal killer, but we are interested to continue the conversation, and maybe there's opportunities on both sides down the road to pick those project areas up again. So these efforts led to the acquisition of 4 new wildlife management areas. The Caribou Stream Wildlife Management Area in northern Aroostook County, you can see if you can see the map, the northern red stars there. There's 2 stars because we acquired lands in 2 different towns. The McQuahawk Wildlife Management Area in southern Aroostook County over on the eastern portion of the map there. The Rangeley Wildlife Management Area in western Maine, Franklin County. And the Lexington Wildlife Management Area in Somerset County, slightly east of the Rangeley area. So there you can see they're fairly well geographically distributed, and I'd like to point out that the McQuahawk Wildlife Management Area was the single largest acquisition by the agency to date. So 6,326 acres, created a whole new management area in one fell swoop, so exciting things. The acquisition process really is driven in large part, the timing is tied back into the due diligence needs to adequately ensure that the parcel is what we think it is and that we have our obligations met relative to the funding sources. Capacity within the department and sometimes can be a challenge to navigate through and react to the moving pieces at any one time. But more importantly, external capacity of private professionals can be a challenge in terms of the timeline that we are able to accomplish things. Specifically, surveyors and appraisers are a premium in terms of the due diligence items that we need to take advantage of. In addition to the funding opportunities, sometimes are tied to grant offers or opportunities to submit proposals. Good thing on the federal side is that we have open ongoing 5-year grants that we can somewhat easily amend, but we need to pull together multiple different funding sources to make these projects happen. Great, thank you. So I'll talk a little bit more about the specific acquisitions. The Caribou Stream Wildlife Management Area, which was acquired in 2023. It was a combination of Land for Maine's Future funding, Pittman Robinson funding through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Deer Management Fund. We ended up acquiring 2 units, one in Washburn and one in Woodland. The initial acreage totaled 918 acres between both of the parcels, and we've subsequently brought the total acreage up to 1,073 with some other acquisitions last year. What's depicted here on the map is the Washburn unit, and I'd point out that the 5-acre outlot kind of highlighted in the middle is one of those small acquisitions that we work to acquire, mostly to reduce potential conflict between who owns that parcel in the state public land. So kind of a minor acquisition, but I think pretty strategic in terms of our ability to administer the land. Next slide, please. The Woodland unit was a total of 296 acres in the initial acquisition, and the department identified through further habitat assessment that the parcel to the north of that was of interest to us, and we acquired those additional 150 acres last year in 2024. That parcel was interesting because it's ideally suited for management purposes. It allows us to cross the stream in an appropriate location, and opens up some additional management acres for us to consider. So as we've acquired lands, we've started to transition to management and stewardship of those properties. And I point out that we, as a component of our federal aid obligations and our state process here, the first thing we do is develop a management plan. So that'll be consistent across the 4 parcels we've acquired. The first step is to develop a management plan. That helps drive our considerations in terms of access and where do we want people to get to on the property with vehicles. Are there areas that we necessarily may not want them to be able to access via vehicles? And so we start to administer the lands under guidance from the Wildlife Management Area Plan. We also identified several access improvement needs, areas where roads were not to best management practice standards and had the potential to impact water resources on the parcels. So again, the first step initially is we look to what is the access, is it sufficient, is it degraded, what do we need to do to adequately get out to the parcel to manage the land from our perspective, and if we have the public access, and is it safe and functional for them to access as well. We had to negotiate and execute right-of-way maintenance agreements with abutters on both the Woodland and Washburn parcel, which were successful. And another thing that is consistent across all of the parcels is that in addition to our conservation, acquisition, and subsequent management, we wanted to craft a method that we could outreach to provide technical assistance and information to our abutting landowners. And that does a few things. It makes folks a little more comfortable with who owns land next to them, provides them an opportunity for them to know who to contact if there are issues, but also allows us to advocate or provide additional information that they might choose to manage their lands more consistent with what we might be looking at in the management area. So it's a way to try to increase the effectiveness of our management by engaging with adjacent landowners. And sometimes that ends up into potential additional conservation projects depending on the landowners and where the family or where landowners might be at the time. So again, I pointed out that we are obligated to produce a management plan. Our federal aid requirements are another layer of diligence that we need to address before we actually conduct management. We need federal Endangered Species Act compliance relative to protected species. We also need Section 106 historical preservation compliance to make sure there's no cultural or historic resources that might be impacted. And we also have to be compliant with the National Environmental Protection Act. Next slide, please. McQuahawk Wildlife Management Area, originally referred to as the Reed Deadwater Project. That is in the North Yarmouth Academy Grant in, I believe, Milwaukee Township. 6,326 acres, combination of Land for Maine's Future, Pittman Robinson, and Deer Management Funding helped acquire that land. And this one's rather unique in that it's a combination of both wetland and upland habitat conditions. Reed Deadwater is a very picturesque, great paddle, and so there's a lot of recreational opportunities on the parcel, and provides a good basis for us to manage for deer habitat. Again, we developed the wildlife management area plan and identified access improvement needs for that. As luck would have it, the recent winter storms we've had over the last couple of years have impacted some infrastructure on the property. Specifically, 2 bridges need to now be rebuilt completely, and a third needs to be substantially altered to address the issues that were a result of those storms. And we're currently in engineering phase, so we have an engineer under contract to assist with those improvements in hopes of doing the construction this coming year. We have started the installation of food plots throughout the property. Only a few to start, but we're working towards getting some additional forage on the landscape to help support our efforts. We've also identified 500 acres of potential pre-commercial thinning to reduce competition in steer species composition of regenerated softwood in a direction that we think more favorable. So we're gearing up to source funding and bring additional funding to help in that effort. And we're also assessing the potential for browse production areas adjacent to existing cover, maybe in combination with this pre-commercial treatment that we're looking to undertake. The Rangeley Wildlife Management Area was acquired again in 2023, 700 acres in the town of Rangeley. Public access is off of Route 16, and it sits between Dodge Pond and Ross Pond, so the north side of Route 16. This area was interesting when it came across our desk as an opportunity, in that we've done numerous historic surveys and assessments of this parcel, and so we were quite familiar with the habitat value, and it was pretty easy to go through our determination process to say, yes, this is something that we have interest in. One of the access improvement needs that we identified on the parcel is related to the public access onto it. Right now, we own fee ownership out to Route 16, but there's a commercial gravel pit that shares that same access road with the right-of-way that they've retained. And so we're looking to partition off those uses to make it safer for the public to get on and off the property. We also conducted a thorough timber cruise and vegetation analysis because of the knowledge that we had from the parcel. We had suspected and confirmed that we have some management challenges related to age class of the forest and the species composition. So basically, there's a lot of over-mature or decadent balsam fir that we have identified as a need to start to transition that stand into better cover down the road in the future. So some management considerations that have been identified in that regard. And same thing, we're conducting technical assistance and public outreach to the abutting properties that we feel would be amenable, or at least an option to help manage their properties consistent with deer habitat. So the Lexington Wildlife Management Area was acquired in 2023, 1,490 acres, and Pittman Robinson and Deer Management Funds worked to acquire that land. Public access is off the last Roundup Road on the southern end of the property. And again, this one was a particularly good acquisition from my perspective because it's been managed in conjunction with a private landowner since the early 90s, I believe. There are portions of protection area, fish and wildlife, so PFW zone deer yards on the property, and they were more than amenable to working with the agency to conduct decent management through the course of time. So this is really set up well to help achieve our objectives. We also identified access improvements. Currently, this winter, we're clearing the right-of-way in preparation for upgrading the road for better public access and good management access as well. Moving forward, we're focused on continuing our management efforts to address access and improve habitat conditions. That'll continue to build once we improve the access from our perspective. We didn't want to put the cart before the horse, so to say. So we're looking to improve, maintain the access, make it safe, and then have more focus on the habitat management conditions. We're also continuing acquisition efforts and ongoing review of current project areas that we have and identification of additional opportunities. We currently have a proposal for additional staff capacity for acquisition, in part dedicated towards deer habitat efforts. And so we want to have a focused effort so that people can be more reactive, in that we can drum up more interest, or not more interest, but more areas that we can work through to assess. A few lessons that I've kind of gleaned from the whole process is that it reinforces the importance of our deer wintering area surveys. So annually, through the winter months, we survey deer yards both on foot and through the air. And that really helps guide our current understanding of what's important for deer. You have to kind of think feeding sometimes deer to where they might not be without it. But it's important for us to continue to survey deer in a yarding wintering period for sure. And then we spend a lot of time and energy in the review process, so we just need to be diligent to make sure that projects, number one, are feasible, and that they're going to be valuable addition to the effort to help achieve the goal of providing high-quality deer wintering habitat and areas for deer to persist on the landscape. And then I'll speak to that internal and external capacity is always a pinch point as we try to get projects done. Now I'll transition over to our predation management program, and just real quickly talk about how we operate a program through the state of Maine. The most recent iteration really was a genesis or a result of a 2008 deer predation working group, which advocated for the state assuming some responsibility for predator management relative to deer. The current iteration was implemented in 2011, if I recall correctly, in March of 2011 by the commissioner at the time, Chandler Woodcock, and was a minor allocation. I think $11,000 is what we were authorized to spend under that initial year. Subsequently, there was an expansion of funding through an allocation by the legislature, and currently the program is funded through the Deer Management Fund and registration fees collected with deer registration. So the program is focused on reducing coyote predation in and adjacent to priority deer wintering areas. It includes an early trapping component prior to winter yarding, followed up with the hunting efforts through the course of the yarding period until deer disperse or the winter ends. So the priority areas are generally those that are supporting wintering deer, and the intent is to provide effort where recreational trapping and hunting might be minimal on the landscape. So it's a way to provide additional opportunity in other parts of the state that might not see a lot of recreational pressure. The trapping component begins in mid-October, 3 days after the early fox and coyote trapping season, and continues through the end of November. The hunting program begins when there's sufficient snow to adequately provide for effective monitoring of coyotes and their interactions with deer on the landscape. And go back one. We'll talk about this slide a little bit, and then I'll be done, I promise. So over the last several years, we've maintained a kind of a static 55 deer wintering area priority list of areas that we have on our radar. We work with 41 contractors, 19 of those are trappers, 28 of those are hunters, and there's some that do both, which is the discrepancy in the numbers. A little bit of analysis, but not a deep dive. Since 2013, we have harvested 3,884 coyotes, with an average of 312 harvested per year under all methods. And we use hounds folks as well, so they hunt with hounds, bait, and trap. And the average cost per animal works out to be $178. I would point out that I discounted the first 2 years where we got off to a slow start with the program. And I've counted the years where we had those funding allocations through the legislature and the Deer Management Fund. With that, I'll take any questions folks might have.
Yeah, I manage, along with Daniel, a social media group of 50,000 members called Maine Deer Hunters. Great presentation, by the way. We've had a bunch of questions lately about where can we find this information easily and quickly. They're especially curious about the new acquisitions, deer wintering areas.
You're curious about the what?
The newer deer wintering area acquisitions.
Yeah, that's good. We sort of held back on not advocating or advertising, these properties, in part because we're looking to roll out, and I'll probably let Tim or Nate talk about our platform, basically a platform to convey wildlife management areas and what uses and what the purpose is in a public-facing platform in a spatial data set. So that's something that we've kind of been hopeful would be a good opportunity to make sure that all of these properties are depicted on the landscape and people know how to access them.
Yeah, I can add that a little bit. So we have done some press releases as well, but part of it too is public access to these isn't always good initially, and so we're reluctant to kind of promote them as, hey, here's a place to go until we get that access sort of up to a standard where it can, people can get into those, reasonably well and safely.
Estimate on when we might get that?
Well, so I think what Ryan is alluding to is the department's app, which is, Tim can probably speak more on that in terms of the timing, but we will be rolling out a map of our WMAs on that app, which will be available pretty soon, so it'll make it easier for people to find and see where these are on the landscape.
All right.
The other thing I would add is that we immediately and automatically update the Conserved Lands data set, which is a public-facing set of information that people can use to update their knowledge. If you're savvy enough, you can use there's a web viewer in that platform as well. That's where like Onyx or these other apps pick up their information from. So it should come in the kind of the back end of that as well.
I'm not smart enough to figure it out. But
it can be a little bit technical. So that's why we're trying to get this app off the ground and running to provide that easy access to our information.
Great.
Yeah, Bob, to your question, if people want to know what has been conserved with the antlerless deer permit money for deer yards, I can work with Daniel to apply that to our website so people can see where those acquisitions are. But if you're looking for a place to hunt, if you focused on just the deer yards, you're missing the boat because.
No, I think the questions are more, where's the money going?
Yeah, I think I can help with that, and we can put that. I'll work with Daniel.
But we can
put
be
that up
patient.
on our website. But I want to mention that IFW has quite a land base of other properties where hunting is allowed. I think you're over 100,000.
140,000.
140,000 acres of land that they own. So if that's what people are looking at,
We can definitely work with you on some focused information on how we're spending that new money. I think we had a social media blog post recently that went out to our channels just in January. So we do have some information summarized for how we've been spending this new money with the $12 fee. All of these projects have.
And is that on the website?
It is, yeah.
Okay, I'll find it.
Just a couple of other things I wanted to mention that I think are important as we look to acquire land. Land ownership is a permanent commitment, so we take that very seriously. We're very careful about which lands we acquire, and Ryan mentioned that due diligence process. It's really important to make sure we're getting the right parcels that are a good fit for our ownership. The other things that can be a factor or a challenge is that we can't pay more than appraised value, so we have to get an appraisal, as Ryan mentioned. In a lot of cases, the landowner is looking for more revenue than that, so that can make proceeding with those projects a challenge if we can't pay what they're looking for. And then any acquisition that comes to the state, it needs to have deeded public access too, and that can also be another hurdle that we have to work through. So there's a lot of factors that we have to work through as a public agency that are different from what a private citizen might have to consider when they're looking to make a sort of a private deal. So there's a lot to it, and we have a great team working on it. So lots more to come in the future.
More to come. Any other questions?
I would have a. Go ahead, Tim.
I just want to follow up on, we have not announced it yet. Judy just walked in, she'll probably shoot me, but We're probably within, I don't know, a couple of weeks, I'd say less than a month away from pushing that app out to the public. It's actually in the Apple App Store, loading it up right now for whatever they do. It's been submitted to them. And that will be an interactive map where you can see these wildlife management areas. And it'll actually show the access points on it. So I think it's going to be very helpful to the public and hunters. I think you'll be pretty impressed with that accessibility piece. And these, I don't think they're going to identify them as purchased with the deer management fund, but they are part of our wildlife management area system. You can get the other piece of that from our website and Nate's information. But the general public's going to have, like right here in Augusta, the Garcelon was at 5,000 acres. And it's going to have all the access points to Garcelon right at your fingertips. So I think it's going to be very helpful.
Very nice.
Yeah, it'll also talk about what opportunities might be available at any given property, and also some, what are the restrictions, that we have for administering lands. There was another question there. Go ahead.
Yes, my name is Jenny Thompson, and I'm a SAM member. I live in the town of Morrill, which is out near Belfast. If my understanding is right, the funding for the deer management fund comes from deer permits, which is the antlerless program, am I right?
Correct. And also there's a registration fee for registered deer.
When you get a tagging the deer, right? Okay. Well, I guess my comment is that the antlerless system, as it used to be, was a lottery. You got one, extra one, in addition to if you got a buck, you could get that. But now, with the multiple antlerless permits that are being made available throughout the whole season, we're seeing a real decline in our deer herd. And I know that neighboring communities are as well. And we're concerned about that. It also, am I talking too loud? I'm sorry.
No.
Because I have a little...
It's nice to hear you.
A little hearing problem. So sometimes I try. Anyway. It also, when I see emails come to me that says, we have more antlerless permits available. Get some more now. It fosters some kind of wrong attitude in our younger hunters. Maybe not necessarily the younger ones, but it's like, who needs 3 deer? Really? It's too much. And if each hunter who lives in a certain area now has access and can go out and get 3 deer, maybe they won't think to spread out where they're hunting from.
Yep.
We're seeing a real decline, and so that doesn't seem, when we talk about we need a balance and all of that, we're taking money and deer out of some areas, and we're funneling into the deer wintering yard habitats at the expense of our deer herd.
Well, I guess a few things. I'll start with how we allocate the antlerless deer permit system, and that's why those are allocated at a wildlife management district area level, and we do that to adequately collect enough biological data, mostly through the harvest, to indicate what's the health of the herd, what's their reproductivity, some other metrics that help guide our considerations through our deer management plan. So that permit allocation system is a combination of a bunch of different metrics. There's the impact on any given winter for deer mortality. There's other mortality that's considered relative to the deer herd. So permits are allocated based on biological information that we collect about the health of the deer herd within that wildlife management district. That really drives the numbers. What we've struggled with, especially in mid-coast and southern and coastal Maine for sure, is we haven't been able to reach our harvest objectives for, in some instances, many years. And so we identified this as an opportunity to, in effect, increase the harvest, to help achieve our deer management goals that are established at that wildlife management district level. And so there's that information helps guide that. I think, Jen, our game section supervisor, might have a little bit better way to articulate, that concept. But, that's where we end up allocating antlerless deer permits, is based on the harvest metrics that we see in the health of the deer herd.
Harvest metrics, is that the same thing, that's not the same thing as deer count or survey, is it?
Well, Jen, maybe you can elaborate on that question a little bit.
I think what Ryan's trying to articulate is there's a bunch of different information that goes into how we estimate abundance. And so harvest is part of that information. We have other measures like winter severity, and we use that, all these different pieces of information to come up with our estimates of how deer are doing in each different area. And I'm not surprised that you're seeing a reduction, because that was our intent, right? We were above or below our harvest objective and above our abundance estimates in some of these areas. And so that was our goal, was to increase harvest and have some local reduction in deer numbers. And so that's not a surprise. If it becomes to a level that's concerning, then we could adjust that. And that's what the permit structure allows us to do. And that's something we evaluate every year. So we'll keep that in mind, your feedback, and continue to adapt with that.
Can I further ask a question on this deer harvest goal? How does that get determined, and what is your strategy? What are the determining factors to say some year we need this much, and if we're seeing these decreases, it's not matching up. What we're seeing, and this is just secondhand and firsthand myself, information, you're saying, well, we needed to kill 1,000 more. Where are those 1,000 more? Because they're not on my land.
And so we're managing at a wildlife management district level, and I think
Yeah,
you're
on the
looking
whole
at, right,
district.
and you're looking at an
Right.
individual property. And so you might have some extra hunting pressure that's occurring in your area, and that you're seeing that, but that's not the level that we manage at. We don't manage at the property level, at the wildlife management district level. And so we have objectives for that unit.
The point that Ginny made is something that I also share, and that is the devaluing of a big game animal like white-tailed deer. And I don't know if it's happening widespread, but it does seem like I've heard an attitude change among some hunters. I had one man call me and say, I want to kill as many deer as I want, not pay $12. And I said, well, how many deer is enough for you? And he said, well, when all my family and friends have deer meat, then that's enough. So I do think that there's something to what Ginny is saying, that we also have to make sure that we educate that these are a magnificent animal. Some areas we want to bring them back because they're disappearing. In other areas we do want to reduce the herd, but I do understand what she's saying. There's some people devaluing this amazing animal.
The whole hunting experience, it's like it's just killing. Okay, I can get 3. Oh, great! I'll just boom, boom, boom. I'll get them. It is a devaluing, and I don't think that might have been taken into consideration.
Yeah, I guess,
Along with all the other metrics, that's one of them.
I guess what I would offer, I mean, I would say up and down the eastern seaboard, and that creeps up in the southern and coastal Maine. White-tailed deer in general, I think, have been devalued by the broader public. They're so abundant and overabundant in much of, the eastern coastline that, there's talk of fertility control in some places, there's sharpshooters, there's all kinds of metrics being used up and down the East Coast to control white-tailed deer. And it's at a point in many places where the general public does not value deer and sees them as really a problem animal. And we're certainly sensitive to not getting to that point here in Maine, which is in part why it is important to make sure that the deer population, particularly in the southern coastal part of the state where the habitat is really good, the winters are mild, there's a higher human density, which in many cases makes hunting more challenging, that we ensure the deer population doesn't get to the point where we're seeing vehicle collisions, Lyme disease, crop damage, damage to ornamental plants, that sort of thing, that reach the point where the general public just doesn't want deer around. So that's the balance we're trying to strike, and that does require harvesting antlerless deer, harvesting does. And so the new system it has been successful in increasing antlerless harvest. There are a few hunters that are taking multiple deer. That is the minority, though. There's very few hunters that shoot 2, 3, 4 deer a year. There's a handful. But it has allowed us to increase the harvest enough that we're more effectively managing the deer population in that part of the state and preventing it from growing to a level that's really problematic. But I absolutely hear you, and I've seen the same thing. I think, anytime you speak of a big group, there's a lot of hunters in Maine. There are going to be certain hunters that, I think maybe think and act and behave and communicate in a way that I'm sure the people in this room wouldn't be supportive of. We're aware of that, but at the same time, there has been a need to increase the doe harvest in particular. So I think it's something we can all work on, through our networks and the hunters that we know, to make sure that that doesn't result in a decline in the value of deer to hunters. So I hear you. I think you're absolutely right. But on the flip side, we want to make sure we're maintaining appropriate deer populations so that the general public retains support for deer as well. It's a tough balance.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you all. Oh, there's one more question?
Could you address the, when deer eat and graze in places where they put waste in the ground?
You're speaking PFAS? Yeah.
PFAS. Yep.
Thank you.
David?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So, PFAS and deer and turkey, that's, if there's time, maybe I can speak to that for a couple minutes.
Yep.
So, we've been putting a lot of effort into that issue. That issue really, it came onto our radar because of hunters in the Fairfield area that were kind of watching what was going on there with well water and other areas of contamination, and were curious if there was an impact in deer. It is not something that we at that time, really had thought that much about. PFAS in wildlife, until the last couple of years, has not been something for which there's been a lot of effort dedicated towards anywhere in the world. So I think it was in fall of 2021, we sampled 8 deer in the Fairfield area just out of curiosity to see, is there an impact here? Is there any level of contamination in deer that warrants any kind of concern from a human health perspective for hunters? And we were a little bit surprised that they did come back with elevated levels that warranted an advisory to hunters. So we acted pretty conservatively and established a pretty large area, about 125 square miles that fall, recommended that hunters not consume the meat from deer they harvested in that area until we could do further testing. We followed that up in summer of 2022, summer and fall, with a pretty extensive sampling program, both in deer and in wild turkey, and thankfully found that the contamination was really very limited to those contaminated fields and immediately adjacent to those fields. And so we were able to shrink the size of that advisory to about 25 square miles. So about an 80% reduction, and confirmed that as soon as you got a mile or two away from those fields, the deer are safe to eat, the turkeys are safe to eat. Since then, we've been doing sampling in some other locations, the broader Unity area and a few other locations. We found 3 additional areas for which we issued advisories this past fall. Those are about 3 square miles, 4 square miles in that range, where we're recommending hunters don't consume deer or turkey that they harvest in those areas. But really the good news is that the broader sampling that we've done across the Maine landscape has indicated that levels of contamination in deer and turkey that are high enough to warrant any concern for hunters is limited to fields that have extremely high levels in soil. And the radius or the distance from those fields is pretty small, about a mile or 2. So this does not appear to be like a landscape level issue in Maine. It's really, you almost think of these as sort of hazardous waste sites where, we're recommending no consumption of deer and turkey, but it does not appear there is this broader landscape level issue in the state. I expect we will probably have a handful, a few more areas over the next year that we issue advisories in, but we're not anticipating it's going to be, kind of a broad brush across the state or anything like that.
I had asked you, Nate, to do a presentation. I've had several calls, one just last week about wolves being elevated to a priority level for the, could you speak to that? Because that scares people, and without fully understanding why that is, then it's easy to be fielding a lot of phone calls in a hurry if people think wolves are coming back to Maine or somehow being protected. So if you could speak to that,
Yeah,
that might be helpful.
I can spend as much time as you want talking about wolves. I worked on wolves for about a decade out in Western Canada, so have a background. I thought I would start by just giving a quick overview of coyotes and the eastern coyote and what we have here. I don't think it's possible to talk about wolves in Maine without talking about the eastern coyote. So that animal on the wall, if it came from Maine, it has some percent of wolf ancestry. We've done genetics work here in Maine. There's other genetics work done elsewhere in New England that's shown that what we call the coyote, the eastern coyote, has wolf ancestry, also has typically a small component of dog ancestry as well. So we still call them the same species, Canis latrans, the coyote, but they're a little bit different from the western coyote, and there's much more variability in their body size. They tend to be a little bit bigger than the western coyote, and there's a lot more variation in their coat color, some of their physical characteristics, their skull structure, because of that mixed ancestry. So that complicates any discussion around wolves in Maine, because we now have this animal that was not historically here. We did not historically have coyotes present in the state. They came here on their own, so they're naturalized after wolves were extirpated 100 plus years ago. But they have some wolf ancestry, they have some wolf-like characteristics. Their behavior is a little bit more wolf-like. They're arguably more effective predators on deer, for example, than the western coyote. But they are not wolves. They are not effective predators on moose. Not to say they never prey on moose, but it's extremely rare to the point where we essentially don't really see it as a factor. Whereas, in a place like Maine, with the prey base that we have in northern Maine, comprised primarily of moose, wolves would be the primary source of mortality where they'd be present. So any discussion around wolves, you have to think of coyotes. The wolves that are most likely the ones that could show up in Maine, which are across the St. Lawrence and Quebec and in the Algonquin Park region of Ontario. Those are both kind of smaller wolves. There's some debate about their genetics and whether they're true Canis lupus gray wolves or something intermediate between coyotes and wolves. But they're a little bit more like our eastern coyote than they are like wolves in Yellowstone and Alaska. And that means that were they to show up here, they would likely interbreed with the coyotes that we have here, rather than establish sort of a separate breeding population. We have documented in the past few decades a handful of wolves in Maine. Most of those we confirmed to be either hybrids, potentially released hybrids or escaped hybrids, or wolves that likely had some kind of domestic origin. So when we analyzed their diet from hair, there's a methodology you can use to look at their diet. They had a corn-based diet, which indicates they had likely been being fed, human food, dog food, something like that. So most of the wolves, there's only been a handful that we've documented in the state in the past few decades. They were likely of some kind of domestic origin. That being said, we are well within the dispersal range of wolves. It is entirely possible that wolves from Quebec or elsewhere in Ontario could wander into Maine. They're very capable of making those long distance movements. They can move hundreds of miles. The challenge, though, is that were they to show up here, they're in the sea of eastern coyotes, and most likely they would view those coyotes as potential mates, and any reproduction would be sort of swamped genetically by the coyotes that we have here. There's a lot of debate in the scientific community regarding whether that Algonquin type wolf or the wolf that's in southern Quebec is a true wolf, whether if it were to occur in the US, whether it would meet the definition of a Canis lupus protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act or not. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is working on a national wolf recovery plan that they, I believe, have a court-ordered deadline of this coming December to publish, and we're kind of hoping that will create some clarity around the genetics issue and sort of what's a wolf, what's protected under the ESA federally, and what is not. But at this point, there's often debate about is this a wolf or not, and if it is a wolf, is it enough of a wolf to be protected under the federal ESA? So we have these debates and discussions with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and everybody throws up their hand. I don't know. Does it look like a wolf or not? And we have different perspectives on that as well. And typically, we end up sending genetic samples to multiple labs. Often they disagree about what it is and what its ancestry is. So it's not an easy thing to figure out. In terms of wolves here in Maine, so wolves are federally listed. Canis lupus is federally listed as threatened. So if a wolf were to be confirmed here, it would be protected under the ESA. Wolves do not have any special listing status in Maine. They're not state threatened. They're not state endangered. We consider them to be extirpated, not present. The State Wildlife Action Plan, which is the planning effort that David mentioned, so as part of that planning effort as an agency, we list all of the species that have some type of conservation status in the state. Wolves do, because they're federally listed. That is a federal law. They are currently listed. That could change in the future, but right now they are. Which means that, again, if they showed up here, and if one showed up here and we were able to, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined it to be a wolf, it would be protected. So that is the reason that we are proposing to include wolves as a species of greatest conservation need in the State Wildlife Action Plan. It's in recognition of their federal status as a threatened species. It does not imply that we think they're here now in terms of a breeding population. It does not imply that we as an agency are promoting their recovery in any way. In fact, wolf reintroduction would require specific approval by the legislature. So there is no active plan to bring wolves into the state or to really do anything differently than we're doing now, which is if they're here, we have to protect them. That's the law. And we do follow up on any kind of credible public report to investigate and try to get a DNA sample to see if this animal is a wolf or not. It's a large wolf like Canid. So we're going to try to get a sample and run the genetics. I will say that we've had hundreds of radio-collared moose, hundreds of radio-collared deer. We have camera surveys. We have staff doing track surveys. We are not documenting wolves in the state. We are not seeing predation on moose. We are not seeing predation on deer by anything other than our eastern coyotes, the occasional bobcat, maybe a couple of lakes, I think. We're not seeing predation. So there have been media reports and some claims that we have wolves in the state. We do not have any evidence of that whatsoever, but we're looking opportunistically. So.
I appreciate that clarification, because the political world sometimes maybe wants something and wishes for something, and it's nice to hear that that doesn't exist now. I think the dilemma you're going to really have is, no matter what happens with so-called wolf, even if a wolf does come down, if it's not genetically a wolf, it's like calling an owl a hawk. It just doesn't work. And I think that would be susceptible to a lawsuit almost instantly. So if they try to call it a wolf and it's not, then I imagine it'll be in the court system for quite some time.
Yeah, I can give you an example. So when we did our genetics work on eastern coyotes back in the early 2000s, the animal with the most wolf ancestry was an 86% wolf ancestry, and you think, well, that thing must look like a wolf. It weighed 26 pounds. It was an adult female. It was the smallest animal in the study, but yet it had a large degree of wolf ancestry. So you can't tell by looking at them. I mean, a true Yellowstone Alaska wolf, they look a lot different than that. There's no question. But the types of wolves that would likely disperse into Maine, I could not tell for sure that this is a wolf or it's an eastern coyote. We would have to get multiple opinions from canid geneticists, and they would probably debate amongst themselves most likely. Unfortunately, it's just really challenging.
I think for realistic purposes, it really doesn't make any difference, because our concerns have always been that they would be a larger predator preying on moose calves, wiping out deer yards and that sort of thing. So for all practical reasons, they'll try to sort out what they are, but the real problem becomes if there's an attempt to say that genetically it's enough wolf genes to protect, then it wipes out your ability to manage and protect the deer yards you're trying to bring back. And I think that's our only concern, is that we still have the ability, and not to wipe out wolves or coyotes, but to manage them in a way that the deer herd can rebound.
I mean, the coyotes, the animal we have here now, they are not effective predators on moose. Again, not to say they never kill moose, but so to me that says they're not filling the ecological role of a wolf, regardless of whatever their genetics are. If they're not preying on moose regularly, which even though the wolves and Algonquins are pretty small, moose are a primary part of their diet. They're not filling the ecological role of a wolf. So for me, that's what, as a biologist, that's what I would sort of, the lens that I would look at it through. The genetics are just, just super challenging. I don't know when or if there'll be a resolution to that debate, or some kind of clear genetic standard that would allow us or the service to say this is a wolf and this is not. It's pretty tough.
Even if they did, we'd probably challenge it.
Yeah, and that was kind of my question is, if you can only determine whether it's an Algonquin wolf or a coyote at the genetic level, then how do you ever manage that?
Good question.
And I think that's what scares us.
Yeah, I think, there's been some coverage in the media that indicates that the animals that we have here now, may have enough wolf-like genes to warrant protection or management as a wolf. And I guess my response to that would be, if that's true, then we can declare victory, because we've got lots of that animal here now. So if there's enough wolf genes in that to consider it a wolf, then I don't think we have to worry about their conservation status.
Well, that's the kind of the hypocrisy of the pro-wolf argument. First, they petitioned the government to create an endangered species recovery plan. They created an endangered species recovery plan. They manage for the species recovers, it hits that goal, and they say, we won, we succeeded, it no longer needs protection, and the first thing to do is file a lawsuit to continue protection of a species that has met the recovery goal under the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah, and there's some other layers to this. So the other one, which I haven't mentioned, is that there's debate over what canid or wolf was here historically. So there's some perspective that we had a true gray wolf, a Canis lupus, which is what's protected under the ESA. There's other theories that we had the red wolf, which is classified by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a different species, Canis rufus. Those are just in North Carolina now. And there's some that feel like there was a distinct eastern wolf that was a distinct species. So that makes it even more challenging, because the ESA wouldn't apply to the Canis lupus, the gray wolf, if that is not what was here historically. And there's not, the debate over that isn't settled. So just another layer of debate and uncertainty what was here, and if it wasn't the Canis lupus gray wolf, then would they be protected if they showed up here or not? Or is that historic canid, the eastern wolf, if that is what was here, does that exist anymore, or is that species extinct?
So there are a lot of hurdles that would have to be overcome before this real wolf protection of the state of Maine.
Again, we're looking at, I think the states are looking at this national recovery planning process to potentially provide some clarity from at the federal level on what's a wolf, what's not a wolf, what's protected, what's not. I don't know if it will or not, but there's not been a national gray wolf recovery plan available before, so presumably that will create some level of clarity for us, but we'll have to wait and see.
I suspect with the current administration in Washington, this might be slow walk for a while. When just from what I've heard from the people in Washington that I talk to, there may not be a big push to move this forward. And it might be why we're seeing more and more effort at the state level to protect coyotes. When I hear people who have been advocating for wolf introduction now saying we don't need to do that because we already have a wolf and it's called the coyote, they've openly said that we've given up on wolves and now we're going to try to protect coyotes to do the same thing we want from wolves. And it doesn't seem to meet the straight face test.
Maybe we should build a wall.
Build a wall. So Jen Pashon is probably one of the most knowledgeable bear biologists in New England, probably around the country. I do want to touch on bears because you're just so knowledgeable about it. What is the status of our bear population? Are we meeting the goals that you have to manage for bears? And I guess just give us some feedback on predation as far as bears go as well.
Yeah, good questions.
Yeah.
So I don't know if everybody knows here, I'm no longer the state bear biologist, so about 18 months ago I took a new position with the agency, so I'm the game research and management section supervisor, and so I lead the team of game biologists in the state. But for about 20 years, I served as a state bear biologist and a state Canada lynx biologist, so I have some background in both species, which lynx has a lot of kind of similarities to wolf in the wolf discussions we've had today. But to your question on the status of bears in the state, they're doing very well. They're a species that has done very well for decades, and we recently completed an integrated population model, and that word might seem like confusing, but it's actually, if you think about it, the word integrate. So I think it goes to your question about metrics and what information do you use to estimate how many animals are out there. And so we have a lot of different data for bears. So we have the harvest information, we're monitoring them with a telemetry study that we've had ongoing since 1975. This is the 50th anniversary of our bear study in the state of Maine. It may be one of the longest running. If you talk to Minnesota and Tennessee, they might debate that they have the longest running. I'm going to try to figure out who actually does, so I think we might. And so we've been monitoring for decades, and so we use that information. So we get information on how many females are producing young each year, how many young are they producing, how many of those young survive their first year. And so those are some of the metrics that we're using in this integrated. So an integrated model means you've got all this source of information and you're feeding it all in, and it works together to produce an estimate. And the reason we can do it is because our technology and our models are advancing. And so it's not that we have a change in populations, we have a change in tools that are telling us and informing us more about how the population is doing. If you were to look at our estimates with this new model and this new tool suggest that we have fewer bears than we had a decade ago, but it actually shows that the population's been stable. It's just this new tool is showing us that we probably overestimated with our previous models how many bears are there, but the population has been stable. And so it's pretty exciting to have this new tool, and then this new tool is probably going to continue to evolve and get better informed with new information, and so we're going to get better and better at estimating how many animals are out there on the landscape. But the population is doing really well here in the state of Maine.
Jen, what is the estimated current population with the new tool?
Yes, so I haven't been in the position for 18 months, so now like those numbers are gone. But I want to say it's just under, somewhere around like 25,000.
And that was our target years ago,
Yes.
wasn't it? Yeah,
Yes.
so we're there.
Yeah.
Kind
Average annual harvest.
So it's been interesting with the pandemic, it's really changed our harvest. So prior to the pandemic, for about 10 years, we were harvesting about 3,000 black bears annually. With the pandemic, it's increased to about close to 4,000 bears. We were a little concerned that was going to actually cause some decline, but with the model showing, I think, pre-pandemic when we ran the model, and that's when it was produced right at the beginning, or ran 2008 to 2019, it was showing a stable to slightly increasing population, like growth of maybe 1 to 2%. And even with this harvest of 4,000 animals, or close to 4,000 animals since the pandemic, we're stable to about maybe a 1% growth. So it is affecting some of the growth, but not at the level we anticipated.
Are you seeing any changes geographically, expansion, contraction?
Very slow, and it's really interesting to me because if you go to like our neighbors in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, you're seeing bears in places that we don't see them here in the state of Maine. And I've always been intrigued why is our population here so slow to expand. It's probably because of our management activities and our harvest level, and that most of our bear hunting occurs where we have a lot of bears, and so it's hard for those animals to expand into some of those southern areas. But since I started 25 years ago, we are seeing bears kind of slowly creeping further south, and so there are more bears in the central portion of the state of Maine than there were historically, but it's very slow.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I just can't sit here, I gotta earn my money, so I gotta say something.
We did pay you a lot.
But, like I said in my introduction, I've sat on the IFW committee coming up on 8 years, and it's the #1 sought after committee in the legislature. Everybody puts down on what committee they want to serve on. #1 is IFW committee. The town of Lisbon has been on the IFW committee for, I think, almost 20 years. Somebody from Lisbon has sat on that committee. And these are the professionals. These, and the commissioner, she's in the room, I'm not gonna point her out, but they're professionals, they know what to do. And your questions on the deer and shooting of the deer, they are very well aware of what's going on with the deer herd, the bear, the fish, everything, every animal in this state. This department knows what's going on with it. David Trahan said that it's probably the best in the nation. I would say it's the best in the world in what they do. And I vote with them to give them almost everything they want. There's so many issues I won't go on with, but they are the department. They are at the top of the heap. And I just want to commend them along with the commissioner. We have a very fine commissioner. And I just feel very honored to be on this committee, and I trust what they do, almost.
Trust but verify.
With that, we have one more panel discussion, which I think is incredibly important. It's about the state of journalism in our state. And I want to jump into that. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is good. But we do have some journalists in the room that have been invited to participate on that panel. I'd love to jump into that. We do have a couple of big issues that will be coming out in the upcoming session related to the hatcheries, fee increases, the coyote issues will have to be resolved in the committee. But that's a story for another day. Because we really don't have the landscape yet. We haven't even seen the bills. But we may do some panel like this in the future when we find out what our challenges are. But I wanted to thank you for coming. Thank the commissioner. It is a Friday. And to show up on a Friday this late in the day, I want you to know we appreciated it. So with that, Mike, I think we start our journalism.
You just did it.
We just did it. Well, we have a presentation. Paul Reynolds, who's been an editor at the Bangor Daily News for a long time, I'll let him say how long, is going to give a 6-minute presentation, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. So those journalists that are here for this meeting want to jump up. We'll have Paul's presentation, and then we'll open it up from that point on. Ginny, you're a journalist if you want to join us.
I think I screwed this up.
Yeah, so we'll take a 5-minute bathroom break if you guys want to.
Take a 5-minute break. There's snacks, food.
Right. My water was they charged me for
Yeah, we gotta find it.
if it ever gets taxed, it goes to bottom percentage. Thinking it was that they follow the water that impacted last year. So that, I think it would be hard for us to argue that. If you look at the same it would end up
Feels like it's gotten 20 degrees colder out.
It does, it's colder in here.
There are lots of people who are. And they're going to
Yeah.
All right, hopefully. All right, we're going to try to take our seats and take care of our last panel here.
Yeah. Following presentation, we had hoped that Paul Reynolds, editor of the Northwood Sporting Journal, would be here, but he has, it appears, an ice fishing event to attend, so lucky him. But we had Daniel record what you're about to see. It's about 6 minutes, but it's worth listening to. It'll start the discussion around the state of journalism in Maine. I'll hand it over to Mike, but we can start that video now, and you can, when we're done with that, we'll get into our discussion about the state of journalism in Maine.
Good afternoon. I'm Paul Reynolds, editor of the Northwood Sporting Journal. Sam and David Trahan, the director of SAM, has asked me to make some comments on the state of journalism. And he asked me to explain to you that I do have a background. I have about 50 years in the communication business. Everything from being a newspaper editor, a talk show host, and a syndicated outdoor columnist. For 20 years, I was in the newsroom at the Bangor Daily News, and so I've seen journalism go from 1990 to 2025, and it really has changed immensely. The core values of traditional journalism, back in the day when I ran a newsroom, was fair and balanced reporting. That seems to have disappeared in so many newspapers today, not only with the mainstream media, but also with your own local daily newspapers. In the newsroom of the 1990s, we strived to maintain impartiality. That was critical. And if something had an opinion in it, we labeled it opinion so the reader would know the difference. That's not happening now. And reporters seem to be willing to trade impartiality for some sort of activism. And I'm seeing more and more of that in the news pages, and it's not good. The job of the journalist is not to determine the truth, in my opinion, but to put the facts out and let the readers decide what that truth might be. At the Chapel Hill School of Journalism, they are trying very hard to restore journalism to be fair and balanced. And basically their mission statement is to foster the type of information that will make democracy work. Contrasting that, the University of Maine, where I once taught journalism, their mission statement is something to the effect to to improve the human condition. Well, in my opinion, that's not the role of journalists. The role of journalists is to put the facts out and let the people make the decisions that will improve the human condition. So the bottom line is, to answer David's questions, yes, journalism has changed dramatically in the last 30 years, and not for the good.
Two more presentations, just.
Okay, the second question that David asked me to address is, what is the state of journalism in 2025? That is a very good question, and I'll try to give the shortest answer I can. In my opinion, public trust in journalism today is at the lowest point in the history of this country. This is sad because our founders planned that a free press would grease the wheels of a constitutional republic. And I wish I could be more optimistic about the state of journalism. But daily newspapers, there's no secret, daily newspapers, including the Bangor Daily, the Portland papers, are dying on the vine. That's a big statement, but I think the truth is that it's actually happening. The Southern Maine papers have lost a lot of their people. Their chief executive officers are quitting. The Bangor Daily recently announced that they're going to abandon their editorial pages during the week. This is drastic. I mean, for 100 years, the Bangor Daily's had an editorial page. These are major seismic changes in the state of journalism in 2025. The sharp talk around journalism circles is that the so-called Trump revolution has caused some of these media people to do some in-depth introspection about what they're doing. But the bottom line, in my opinion, is that the media today is completely out of touch with the average people, and I just have a feeling that they're just tone deaf, and I'm not sure they even get it today, and we'll have to wait and see. But the BDN is, as I said, has abandoned 100 years of editorial writing, and this is a sad thing because these are the qualities of newspapers that help foster a good democracy. So I guess the outlook is not as good as I'd like to say. I think our kids are getting the news on TikTok. I think that's a tragedy. And the Portland papers now are being owned by a left-wing media lash-up, some kind of called trust, which raises, I think, ethical questions and so forth. So we'll have to wait to see what happens. But the state of journalism right now is in a desperate state, a state of flux, and we can only hope that some of this changes. Future look like for outdoor writers? Well, I've been an outdoor writer now for 50 years, and as I said earlier, things have really changed. The question, I guess, is, are we going to have outdoor writers continue to survive in this new era that we're in? And the problem is, as newspapers begin to fold, there's less and less marketing opportunity for outdoor writers like myself and others. However, the good news is that according to people who know what they're talking about, niche publications, that would be like the Northland Sporting Journal here, or the Maine Sportsman. These niche publications, they may be able to hang on because we find that if you give people quality reporting about things they care about, let's say hunting and fishing, they will buy the publication. But the challenge is going to be as more and more people go online to get their information, whether it's hunting or fishing or whatever it's about, the more they do that, the less advertising opportunities for these print publications. So I guess the bottom line is outdoor writers are going to have to work harder to find places to market their work, but there's still going to be opportunity. And we can only hope that these niche publications continue to do what they're doing and survive. I think they will. I hope they do. I'm praying that they do.
All right, on that, I'm going to ask our panel to go ahead and, if you don't mind, taking a moment and introducing yourselves so everybody knows who's here.
I'm Bob Humphrey. I'm a freelance writer.
I'm Bill Green. I'm a retired journalist.
I'm Will Lund, editor of the Maine Sportsman Hunting and Fishing magazine.
All right, great. So obviously the topic on this panel is the state of journalism in 2025. So we obviously heard from V. Paul Reynolds. I'll open it up to start with your thoughts.
I'm happy to start, if you'd like.
Thank you. Thank you to Sam for pulling this all together today. In thinking about journalism, I thought back to my first lesson in journalism, which was my Uncle Morton. I was in junior high school. My Uncle Mort wrote for Sports Illustrated, and he wrote for Playboy magazine, which of course made him an instant hero in my book.
I love Sports Illustrated too, Will.
And what he told me, and it was fun. He used to work at our camp out at Papasi County, and he had the first word processor that I ever saw. And he said, "You've got to come see this." He said, "I can have words on the screen, and I can put a word in the middle, and all the other words will move out of the way." And that was considered outstanding and amazing technology in those days. But he showed me, because he wrote for the national magazines, whenever he made a declarative statement in anything that he wrote, he had to footnote it, not for the reader, but for the editor to fact check it later. And that was a great lesson to me about how journalism is supposed to work. Nowadays, as Paul indicated, there's a lot of competition for that. There's been a lot of dilution of the concept of journalism. We are dealing with anonymous posts on the internet. Folks can hide back in the day when you wrote something, you signed your name to it. And if you wrote something on the wall at school, everyone knew your handwriting, so they knew who did it, so you always had to be able to account for it even then. With anonymous posts, there is a loss of understanding about the responsibility that comes with writing something. I get unsolicited submissions every week, if not every day. And I'll write back and I'll thank the folks. I'll say, "We don't really have a lot of room for anything extra, but by the way, where did you get these ideas? Or where did you get this photograph?" "Oh, it was on the internet." That's the answer. That's the journalistic answer at this point. I saw it on the internet. And that's not helpful to me as being the one who's being asked to put it out into the public.
Bill?
Yeah, I'm Bill Green, and I work for, I'm a little bit different than these other guys, because I worked at commercial television stations. And just like newspapers, these are difficult times for commercial media like that. And my specialty became outdoor recreation, and because of Bud Levitt, that meant hunting and fishing. So, but our look at outdoor recreation included swimming, sailing, paddling. Not that that's not outdoor stuff, but mine was not we were far away from putting kill shots on the 6 o'clock news. So we were trying to do hunting and fishing stuff in such a way that it wasn't insulting people at their dinner table in families that didn't hunt and children that didn't hunt. So my perspective was a little bit different. But to go back to what grouchy old Paul Reynolds said, and please stop, I said this is going to be on, because he big times us by going to an ice fishing derby and sends in a video. Jeez, all right. Hi, Paul. But I think we all agree that we moved away from the era where media organizations were objective informers and gatekeepers of information for the reader viewer to consider. And while, if you want to look at it historically, maybe in the 18th and 19th century, it might have been even worse. But for practical purposes, we are into an era of advocacy journalism now, which is a contradiction. It's not, I don't think you can be an advocate in what my definition of a journalist is. But we live in an age where journalists still create the agenda for news, but the platform controls the access. And by platform, I mean the TV station, the newspaper, or any of the social media platforms that we deal in, particularly YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, X, Threads, and TikTok. So journalism, in the definition of fair and balanced, really is losing the battle for the public's interest, because it's not fair and balanced anymore. You pick the side you want to hear, and you can turn on that station or pick up that publication. And we've lost a great deal of public trust because of it. And that's why the numbers are sinking badly. I don't know what the circulation numbers of these publications are, but I know in general numbers are circulation numbers are way down. The companies that fund news are challenged because of the financials of running a newspaper organization, and people here can talk about that better than me. And therefore, this weakens what I call professional journalists. You know, I think, having worked for a TV station where an advertiser could not come in and dictate what I did for stories, and they didn't know it, where my management had to stick up for me when the advertiser came and pulled advertising. Two of the people I got in trouble with were Yoo-Hoo and Toyota down through the years. It leaves the professional, now that there is more influence and there's more almost product placement, etc., it leaves the traditional journalist more vulnerable to commercial and political pressures. So where I could pretty much do what I wanted, some of these young kids that you're seeing now are walking a really fine line between old school journalism and modern advocacy journalism, I think. So, you know, what is the future of journalism? We've reached the era where everyone with a social media account, by a broad definition of journalist, is a journalist. A clever kid on TikTok can easily build a following larger than the publications that are represented here today. Every organization, such as SAM, IFNW, should determine what its story is and have a plan for getting its own story out through its own journalism. And I checked with 3 hunters before I came in, who, the only 3 I know under 35, where they get their outdoor news, and they basically said Facebook. The page, the main Deer Hunters website and stuff like that. So, get on there. You know, get on there and use it. Get your story out through those things. If you are an organization like SAM or a sporting camp or the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, have a good website. And not just a website that's up to date, but make it entertaining, interactive, and refresh it all the time. Because people will come back. If it's the same website, they won't come back. And you need to be on Facebook, YouTube, X, Threads, and if you're so inclined, TikTok. I think that'd be a hell of a TikTok page, right? You know, Deer Hunters, the main Deer Hunters TikTok page would be something to see. And, you know, you cross-promote through the various platforms. For example, Paul gave a very nice speech. He could have cut it into a 10-second spot and put it on X. He could have cut it to a 10-second, a 1-minute spot and put it on YouTube. You could have, you know, and you need to cross-promote within your own journalistic effort to get your word out. But I wouldn't recommend that you sit there and wait for Channel News Center Maine, for whom I work, you know, 5, 8, 13, 7, to come and tell your story, because I don't think they're coming. And I think you have a responsibility now to become a journalist and tell your own story. And you know, if you are, you know, be ready, should anyone come or should anyone be interested, to be that spokesperson, to have the story that you want to tell, whatever the story is, have your thoughts organized and be ready to speak to whomever to get your side of the story out. And those are my thoughts about where journalism today. Journalism has already changed, and certainly I'm behind. And you know, we can't move fast enough into the future to control the story the way we would like.
I'm going to use the dais because this is the time of day when my voice usually abandons me. I'm going to give a little bit of a national perspective, but I think you're going to see a lot of commonality between what I say and what has already been said. Just very brief intro. I've been at this for about 30 years. I've written thousands of articles for well over 100 publications. And I call this the perfect storm. If you're old enough to remember when MTV first debuted, the very first video, back when they used to play music videos, the very first video they played was Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles. It sounded pretty prophetic at the time. It turned out almost to be, but I think radio is doing quite fine. But it did nearly mortally wound the print journalist. Back when I was a kid, we had heroes. We had Jim Zumbo, we had Lefty Kreh, Dick Idle, Jimmy Robinson, Jack O'Connor. These were the heroes of the outdoor world. They wrote for magazines, they wrote books. Then along came videotapes, hunting videos, then DVDs, then outdoor television, which started as The American Sportsman, and then became a series of ESPN Saturday morning, then an outdoor channel, then 3 outdoor channels. Print media was relegated to the next lowest tier, and anyone with a video camera became an instant celebrity. Meanwhile, the industry was plagued with buyouts and consolidations, and I'll give you an example. A company called EMAP bought Peterson's Hunting, Peterson's Bow Hunting. Several other smaller titles canceled the other titles, so 6 went to 2. Intermedia bought EMAP, and they also bought all of the regional game and fish publications, New York Game and Fish, Pennsylvania Game and Fish, Michigan Game and Fish. Then they were bought by Cronkey Outdoors. Then they reduced 37 magazines to 4 regional publications, game and fish publications. And that's just one example. There were many, many more. There was once a dozen bow hunting specific magazines. Now there are 4. Meanwhile, the big 3, Sports Afield is gone. Outdoor Life, Field and Stream are now online only. The national magazines that I write for, much of the copy now is ad driven. It's trying to get you to buy something. Thank God we have tabloids, like the Maine Sportsman and the Northwood Sporting Journal, because they give you what you want to read, not what the editor wants you to read. Another bad trend. Meanwhile, as was already mentioned, the internet. Okay, here's this sudden proliferation of free content. Why should I buy a magazine if I can go online and get free content? Well, for starters, do you know anything about the person that wrote that article? Do they have any credibility whatsoever? Now, instead of the guy that bought a video, the guys that can't afford video cameras, they write blogs. So anyone with a keyboard now is an outdoor hero, an outdoor personality. Brings us down another level. Meanwhile, pay rates. This is my big gripe. I've written for a Maine newspaper, which I won't mention the name of, for 22 years. When I started 22 years ago, I got paid $100 a column. You know what I get paid now? 22 years later, $100 a column. If I were given the annual 4% cost of living adjustment for that, which I should have been, I'd be making $287 a column. So I'm losing out on about $4,000 a year. Advertising costs have gone up. Pay rates haven't. The company the national company that manages the local trust that runs that paper, their CEO increased their 6-figure salary by 65% last year. $100 a column. I've been very fortunate to have traveled around the country, hunted and stayed in some of the finest lodges, met some of the finest people, but I would not recommend anybody go into outdoor journalism now.
So we have one more person who's joined us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, my name is Sam Patton. I'm with the Maine Wire, and I'm filling in for Steve Robinson. I'm the managing editor of the Maine Wire. Steve was hoping to be here, but when the schedule changed, he couldn't make it. So a couple of just quick observations on the state of the media generally. Certainly we have to begin negatively, because there's a lot of negative out there. I agree wholeheartedly with what Bill said about advocacy journalism. I'd call it something worse. We have agenda journalism in America today, and not just America, it's a global phenomenon, where journalists no longer feel It's their job to report the news objectively, the way they teach it in journalism faculties, getting both sides of the story, but to push a certain story. And I've seen this in my career, coming to journalism, back to journalism for politics. And I'm relatively new at the Maine Wire. I was in politics for the last 20 years or so, and I've seen how advocacy and agenda journalism works, and it's not pretty. So the overall picture is pretty negative, but I'd like to, since I'm the last speaker, be a little bit positive here and say that things are changing. Things are changing not just in terms of the media and the medium and people moving from print to video to internet to TikTok to different types of media, but the demand for new information is changing, and that's what's going to drive the media market going forward into the future. While, as was mentioned, the Maine Trust for Local News, a subsidiary of the National Trust for Local News, is cutting costs and cutting journalists. In fact, the Maine Wire is growing. We started out as a small news, basically a newsletter, and now we're a website and a social media operation that has been hiring and getting new journalists, including one of our most recent journalists comes from the Portland Press Herald, where he worked for 30 years because he was let go by the Maine Trust for Local News. So overall, the landscape of the media is changing. My son, who is 25 years old, when he went to college recently, he said he wanted, and he did, he studied media studies. That was his major, and I was terrified. I was terrified because I thought, I want my son to have a good job when he gets out of school. And I didn't know what he was going to do. He's a smart kid, he's a hard worker. Why on earth is he studying media studies? And amazingly, he got a job. He got a job straight out of school, working for a YouTube channel that focuses on the automotive industry. And he developed his particular niche in the charging of electric vehicles. And that's been his thing, and that's the thing that he writes about. And he's got a following, and he got picked up by a major outfit that pays him to do this, and he's been doing this and getting paid for doing it for 2.5 years, but it's very niche. And that's where the media is going. The media is changing in terms of what it is that people are demanding. There's a reason why in my kitchen I've got a stack of Maine Sportsmans, and it's not just because I like Will. It's because when I moved back to Maine, I wanted to have some connection with the place where I live. And there is a demand for local news, which is going to get people to hone in on things like, and I don't want to blow the Maine Wire's horn too much, even though that's my job, but people are going to look at the Maine Wire because they're going to see something that they're not seeing in other places. They're not seeing it coming out of the Portland newspapers. And frankly, the Bangor paper has changed significantly from when I was a kid. It used to be a conservative newspaper. And we don't want to get too much into politics here, but it's now a unionized newspaper. It operates much differently and to a different agenda than it did when I was growing up in the state. And again, it's a generational thing. When I was a kid in high school, and we'll get back to the issue that we started with today, guns in school meant hunting between 5th and 6th period. That's what it used to be all about. And that's changed dramatically now. So how does the media cover this issue? And an incredibly small, I don't know if there's statistics on it, I looked, I couldn't find any. How many journalists own guns? And the answer is not many. During the fall election season, a friend of mine who's an older sort of mentor guy who's worked substantially in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Newsweek, I've always looked up to this guy as sort of a mentor and a wise figure in journalism. And he called me up because his daughter is a college student in Pennsylvania. And she's very politically active, very left-wing, and she wanted to talk to a gun owner. So my friend in Washington, D.C. called me up. We hadn't talked in 6 months because he couldn't think of anybody else to talk to a gun owner. And it kind of blew my mind, but that's where we are. So how can we expect journalists, if you look at the demographic of journalists today, they're younger, they're more urban. And when I think of my own son, who was born in Bangor, Maine, his views on the Second Amendment are very different than my views, because his views were formed by the Parkland shooting, by the Columbine shooting, by all these school shootings. And to be fair, he grew up in an urban environment. But we're speaking different languages. And he doesn't understand where I'm coming from. I try and understand where he's coming from. So educating journalists just about the issues is something that is everybody's job. And I think in this state, I tried, after the session this morning, and there was talk about the Portland Press Herald and some of their advocacy, and it's pretty far out there, really, considering the rest of the state. But I think the Portland Press Herald realizes, as a business, they're failing. They're not making money. They're losing money. And we're seeing this across the media industry overall. I think the left-wing American media is beginning to understand that they're losing market share, and if they want to stay in the business, they're going to have to change. They're going to have to change away from agenda journalism. They're going to have to invite more viewpoints and let people who know what they're talking about argue and make their points. Not just like commenting on a Facebook page, but informed commentary about the issues when it comes to Second Amendment issues, when it comes to hunting issues. Looking at Netflix recently, I saw a European show that talked about a reformed hunter, sort of like a reformed criminal. So in the European mindset, hunting is a bad thing. It's something that people do. It's some sort of caveman-like Paleolithic thing to do to hunt. Whereas here, it's part of our culture. It's part of our heritage. It's part of our life. So that's why journalism, if it's going to survive, and it is going to survive because we're always going to communicate, is going to become more local. And it's going to become more expert focused. The Bangor Daily News recently let all of their columnists go. They fired all their columnists, and they said instead they're going to have experts. I don't know what that means. They let Matt Gagnon, who's the head of the Maine Policy Institute, which owns the Maine Wire, how is he not an expert? I mean, he's the head of the Maine Policy Institute. I don't know what kind of experts they're going to get, but they're lost in the wilderness. I think the Portland Press Herald is also a little bit lost in the wilderness. They have to find a way of getting better informed, better rooted voices to talk on not just their opinion pages, but also their news pages. And I think we're going to continue to see change. I don't think it's the end of the fourth estate, but the media that we're going to be looking at a year from now is very different than the one we've been looking at for the last few years.
I'd like to segue in with what he just said into what my comments were going to be. Nobody in this room knows it, but when I was a kid, I wrote for the Maine Sportsman. That's where I learned that I had a passion to write about the outdoors. I didn't care about anything else. Girls, all of it. I didn't care. I always wanted to hunt and fishing. And that's what I wrote about. Well, that changed in time, but I wanted to be a journalist. And after high school, where I was an athlete, I went on to take some college classes. And I remember the last course I took. The entire course was about how to manipulate a page to emphasize a political position. That was the lesson. And I kept asking the instructor, is that really the role of the journalist, is to manipulate the page, every image, every word, to come out with a political result? And he said, well, this lesson is to teach you that that's basically what's going on now. Well, that was quite a while ago, and I said, well, that's it for me. I don't want to be a journalist then. Because what you're saying is you don't want to show the truth and the facts. You want to create an image to promote a political agenda. So that was my last class. I write all the time. I write the newsletter with people like Ginny. But his comments around the Press Herald, I'm going to speak to that because there's a crossroad that's happening right now. Most people don't understand what the Press Herald has become. Journalism was always independent. It relied on selling ads in newspapers to pay their reporters, which kept them independent. When the Press Herald was struggling, they were trying to find a model to save the Press Herald. There's only a handful of states that allow even an entity like the Trust for Local News. I think there's now 8 maybe. And what they do is they create a hybrid, almost like a nonprofit, that no longer has a journalism goal, but a goal to do public education and charitable type activities. The for-profit component is gone. And now it's like education and charity. Except they're still involved in politics. They have an editorial page, and they're always influencing political issues. This is where the problem is. By creating these low-profit L3Cs, they're called, these entities are allowed to accept foundation monies to do their activities. Many of these foundations are politically motivated. There are some of the far left-leaning foundations that are promoting political policy, that are giving money to a press outlet, calling themselves the press, but accepting money, and then doing political advocacy on their editorial page. That may have saved them from going under, but it destroys their credibility when you understand it. So what frustrated me was when I saw, after the Lewiston shooting, I was interviewed by Frontline for over 3 hours. They shaped the article the way they wanted with the Press-Herald. My frustration is that in order to continue getting money from foundations, you have to lean their way and shape your articles and your editorials to keep the money flowing. The only way the press survives long term, because I can tell you, as former Senate Chair of Taxation, talking with people in Washington, D.C., this country is not going to allow our press to be taken over by billionaires who are funding foundations and flowing that money into the press to then promote an agenda.
Say that again, David.
Okay.
You said our country is not going to allow.
Our Congress is not going to allow foundations that
How are they going to prevent it?
Okay, let me get to that. These foundations are tax exempt under nonprofit law. They don't pay taxes on the money that's coming into those foundations. The intent of nonprofits is to do charitable and educational work, plain and simple. Newspapers do a third thing. They advocate for political positions on their editorial page. Just recently, the Press-Herald called for the repeal of the terrifying yellow flag and replace it with red flag. That's political advocacy. I, as a lobbyist and a nonprofit, have to report to the Maine Ethics Commission. I have to register as a lobbyist. I have to identify how much I've spent and how many hours I've done it. The Press-Herald does not. How is their editorial page any different when they're a nonprofit accepting foundation money, non-taxable? Why are they any different than me? And that is the issue that I have, and the Press-Herald is going to have to struggle with and figure out a different model. You can't do political advocacy with nonprofit money.
But realistically, how do you stop them?
The Ways and Means Committee in Congress are likely to take up this issue as more and more states, I think there's somewhere between 8 and 10 now, that allow these low-profit L3Cs. They're going to have to figure out if they want to channel money, gray money, basically, dark money, into the press, which then manipulates the pages and influences the political issues that you learn about. And that's the part that I think needs to be addressed, and it will be. I know because I brought it to the attention of the right people, and they are looking at it nationally. Should they be doing that? What the Press-Herald could do is they could eliminate taking positions politically on their editorial page. That would resolve some of it.
Which the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times did in this presidential election. They
Do you
decided not to.
Do you think, I'm going to ask some questions. I sense that it has been a little bit more neutral in the last several, do you guys sense that, or am I dreaming?
I was just gonna say, they'd have to change more than their op-ed page, because from cover to cover, it's opinion-based, slanted in one direction for that particular publication.
I can usually read the headline, and then you look down below and it says, from the Washington Post, when they're just bringing opinion pieces basically in like that.
I actually enjoy opinion pieces. It's when editorial pieces are opinionated that I resent it. But I just, I would like to see old school, give me a story like Doge. I want to know what Doge is doing. What are they finding? What you want news? Yeah, I mean, because I don't really know what Doge is doing. I see Elon Musk. My wife has a Tesla. with this kid on his head, right, walking, and I'd like to know what's happening, and I don't know where to find the story sometimes, and it's frustrating.
To your point though, Bill, you just illustrated what my concerns were.
Mhm.
When you said that the Press Herald seems to be going more neutral,
Not the Press Herald. I think several publications will mention the Washington Post.
Yeah.
I think, I'm not happy with the Press Herald here today.
Yeah.
I just think there's been a little bit better journalism in the last few months. And I don't know if I'm dreaming or not.
well, I can tell you that from my perspective, the Press Herald in particular, they're gonna have to do something because they're gonna be on the bubble. When you look at all the L3Cs in Maine, there's nothing like the Press. Everything else is these small little businesses that have a social agenda that are taking advantage of that component, and then you have the Trust for Local News. If they're going to survive, they're going to have to do something to give the appearance that they're not being political. Otherwise, they're going to be told by Congress and others, you can no longer do this. Because you can't mix foundation money. And lawyers have advised foundations interested in giving money to L3Cs, be careful. Because it is a
No,
gray
and
area.
I think that's an interesting story. That's a good news story right there. Can David Trahan, humble and mean guy that he is, rise up against a newspaper protected by the First Amendment because it's receiving, is it trust money that it's getting?
Yeah, it's
You know,
foundation
I mean,
money.
that's a great story. I'd like to get up and have my coffee and read that in the morning because that's interesting.
No, you need to write it.
Well, it's a hard story to do, and how can you get your story out? And it's interesting.
I think that this was, the wheels were set in motion before this last election. I think for the last, probably, at least since COVID, maybe even before, the media was put on alert that people were losing trust and losing faith. And this pushed it right to the front.
See, but I think another way that editorial content is determined is based on who gets hired. And, in my mind, an editor does tell you what story you can do when you run it. In the news, in the television newsroom, the day starts when they cut you overtime back 9 o'clock. And you come in with story ideas, and if you're any good, you had your story the night before, so you could start earlier, but here we go. And you would discuss what it's going to be, and you'd look at the newscast and, okay, that's going to be our lead, that's going to be the first segment, that's the first segment. And then there might be, more of a magazine type of story to lead the second segment, and then they used to have sports, and then weather. And so you kind of have that outline of the day, and then whatever happened that day, happened that day. But based on who's in the newsroom, their personal feelings, you could slant a story, and it can still be true. Right. And so, based on, who the editors are and who the reporters are. Is that a question?
No, that's a statement.
Was that a bid? You bid?
It's a statement addressing what you're saying. A report came out that of all the people hired to be journalists, 99% of them are far left. That's one issue. Another issue is when you've got a political contest, they like to endorse a candidate. And who do you think they endorse every single time? That's bias.
And the same can be said about college campuses. What percentage of your professors are Republicans and what are Democrats? And what outside of your science department are Republicans and Democrats? And so,
I think this has created an opening for a legitimate restoration of journalism, honest journalism. Because it's so refreshing. I've been told more times than not that I am blunt but honest, and that sticks out. Shouldn't that be what all of us do? I think there is an opening right now for a journalist or an outfit to show up and just give you truly accurate information and let you choose. And I think that's coming, and because of what you've been talking about.
We have to trust the market. We have to trust readers, and the media is going to start doing this. Yes, there are billionaires who control the media. If we look at what is the National Trust for Local News, it's a progressive Swiss billionaire named Hans-Georg Weiss and the famous George Soros. Those are two of the major funders of this news organization that owns most of the newspapers in Maine currently, one of whom is not even American. Who owns Twitter? Elon Musk. Billionaires have always been part of the media establishment. That's not necessarily new. What we want them to do is to fight. We want competition because we want, as the public and the readers and the watchers and the consumers of the news have to be the ones who tell the news organizations what to cover. Not how to cover it or what to say, but to demand what kind of coverage, what focus they're looking at. I'll give an example from another country. I spent a lot of time working in the former Soviet Union, a country called Ukraine, which is at war currently. You have East and you have West Ukraine. East, they say, our media, the American media, calls them pro-Russians. That's not necessarily accurate, but still that's what the American media says. So you have the pro-Russians in the East and the pro-Europeans in the West. I've done opinion survey after opinion survey of the Ukrainian public. I've done hundreds of surveys to find out what news channels they watch. And guess what? All of them watch everything. They don't just watch the kind they like. We're naive in America. We decide, oh, we like Fox because it tells us what we want to hear. We like CNN because it tells us what we want to hear. Some people have compared the media to taking a warm bath, something that makes you feel good. Well, it shouldn't be. We need to read everything. I read everything from Mother Jones on the far left to Breitbart on the far right. Why? Because if I don't, I'm not going to have any idea what's going on. It's my job as a person, as a citizen, as a news consumer to read everything. And I think more and more people are becoming wise to that. It's not just that there's fake news on the internet. Sure, there's news that may not be well sourced, but it's our job to figure out what's real and what's not. And we are the market, and we're going to decide, what media we want.
The last, what I thought was objective television news program I watched was Al Jazeera America, ironically enough.
Coming out of Qatar.
And they got rid of it. It's no longer available for us to see. So I don't watch national news.
Any questions before we wrap up? Yeah, go ahead, Penny.
I think I saw on the main line this morning that the top editors in the Portland Press-Herald stepped down.
Laura DeSisto, I think, is what it was talking about. Who had been the head of the. She stepped down in December. But they're facing some changes. And to Bill's point, the media they get it. When President Trump's current press secretary gave her first press conference 2 weeks ago, the first thing she cited, and I apologize, I was a little late, it may have already been mentioned, was a Gallup poll saying that less than 40% of Americans trust the media. That's a big problem for the media. And the media, they can read too. They get it. And the billionaires who own these media outlets, some of them may be happy to lose money, but it's been my experience that rich people don't like losing money. And so they want their businesses to work. That's why Jeff Bezos didn't endorse in the presidential election. He told the Washington Post, pull back. He also probably figured out what was going to happen too, and the Washington Post has to be able to talk to the next president. But still, they're business owners, they're businessmen, and they don't want to lose market share. They need us more than we need them.
David and I communicate frequently. We work together on policy issues. We work together on the State of Maine Sportsman Show, March 28th through 30th at the Augusta Civic Center. Bring all your friends. I do support, he's always disappointed when the magazine comes out because I haven't adopted his latest effort in a headline somewhere. David, you have to read to the end.
Okay.
You have to be subtle.
Okay.
And so this is the Smiling Sportsman toward the end of every Maine Sportsman. Snow White arrived to see her cottage on fire. As she searched through the burning rubble, frantically calling the names of her 7 dwarves, she heard a voice from the collapsed basement say, "A 3-day waiting period for firearms sales is a good idea." "Thank goodness," she said, "at least I know Dopey's alive." So you have to read the whole thing.
Well done. Well, I would like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank the panelists. It's been a long day. Appreciate the folks that are coming here and trusting us enough that we're gonna treat you right, to come here and present. And that's the thing that I take from these SAM Congress, is that people like Nate and Jen and others trust us enough that we're not gonna get you in a gut-ya moment and come here and present, because our members become far more educated when people like yourselves come here and do that, just like these panelists. So I just want to say thank you for that. I will always treat you right. But with that, I think we're going to wrap it up and say thank you to all.
Good job, Dave.